Section 1. The Hidden Architecture. There is a particular feeling you get when you rewatch something you loved as a kid, or maybe something you watched late at night with the volume turned down low so nobody in the house would notice. You remember laughing, you remember thinking it was sharp and fast and a little dangerous, and then you go back to it years later, older, more awake to things, and you realize it was doing something you never fully registered the first time. Family Guy is that show for a lot of people. On the surface, it reads as a chaos machine. A dysfunctional family in a fictional Rhode Island town stumbles through plots that barely hold together, interrupted constantly by jokes that seem to have nothing to do with anything happening in the story. A man says something mildly observational, and the screen cuts away to a chicken fighting a guy in a parking lot. A baby builds a laser cannon. A dog drinks a martini and argues about Hemingway. And if you only half watch it, which is honestly how most people watched it, lying on a couch at 2 in the morning with their phone in their hand, hasawai, you might walk away thinking it was just noise. But the show was never just noise. Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999, right after Super Bowl 33 on Fox. That premiere pulled in around 22 million viewers, which is one of the largest audiences any animated show had ever launched to. And from the very first frame, Seth MacFarlane was doing something that most people who laughed at it never quite articulated. He was building a portrait of American family life that was genuinely uncomfortable to look at directly. So he hid it. He buried it under cutaway gags and shock jokes, and the kind of humor that makes people feel like they're getting away with something just by watching. The show that people dismiss as lowbrow is, depending on which season and which episode you're talking about, one of the most architecturally careful pieces of long-form animated storytelling ever made for network television. This is not a claim about every episode. Not even most episodes, if we're being honest. The show ran for well over 2 decades and produced somewhere north of 400 episodes, and like any long-running series, plenty of them are thin, half-formed, or simply not very interesting. But there is a spine running through the best of Family Guy. A consistent set of concerns, emotional preoccupations, and formal choices that reveals itself slowly, the way a piece of music reveals itself when you listen past the obvious melody and start hearing what the instruments underneath are doing. Seth MacFarlane built the show from his own history. He was born in 1973 in Kent, Connecticut, and he grew up watching classic Hollywood musicals, Golden Age animation, and old-school variety television. He studied at the Rhode Island School of Design. He worked at Hanna-Barbera in the 1990s, where he wrote and animated for shows like Johnny Bravo and Dexter's Laboratory. Before Family Guy ever existed, he created 2 short animated films called The Life of Larry and Steve, which starred a middle-aged man named Larry and his talking dog Steve. If you watch those shorts with the knowledge of what they became, the lineage is obvious. Larry is Peter. Steve is Brian. The basic emotional architecture was already in place before MacFarlane even had a network deal. He took those characters, wrapped a family around them, and pitched a 15-minute pilot to Fox in 1998. The studio gave him the green light, and what followed was a show that spent its entire run being misread by critics, dismissed by competitors, and simultaneously loved by an enormous audience who sensed, even without being able to name it, that the show was reaching towards something real. The hidden architecture of Family Guy is built on a very specific tension. The world of Quahog, Rhode Island, the fictional town where the Griffins live, operates on the same rules as any sitcom suburb. There are neighbors, schools, bars, churches, jobs, holidays. The rhythms of daily life are all present. But underneath that recognizable suburban texture, the show has a dark undertow. The family that lives in that house at 31 Spooner Street is, if you look at them with any honesty, a collection of broken people trying to get through their days. Peter Griffin is a man who lives mostly in his impulses, unable to bridge the gap between who he wants to be and who he actually is. Lois is a woman who gave up a more complex identity to become a wife and mother, and spends most of the series managing the quiet grief of that trade. Brian is an intellectual who cannot produce the work that would justify his identity as one. Stewie is a child so neglected and so extraordinary that he has constructed an entire inner world to survive his outer one. Meg is perhaps the most honest character in the whole show, a teenager who simply wants to be seen and is not. These are not cartoon premises. These are human problems. And Family Guy, at its most careful, treats them with the kind of oblique seriousness that you can only get away with when everything around it is absurd enough to give the audience cover. The cutaway gag, the format that makes the show uniquely itself, is part of this architecture and not in the way critics usually describe it. The easy critique of cutaway gags is that they replace storytelling with sketch comedy, that they're lazy substitutes for plot development. And in the later seasons, that criticism has real weight. But in the show's best years, the cutaway is something stranger and more interesting. It functions as a kind of free associative commentary on what the characters are feeling, a way of externalizing interior states that the characters themselves won't or can't articulate. When Peter compares something to a random, seemingly unrelated event, he is almost always deflecting from something emotionally true. The absurdity is the deflection. The joke is the avoidance. And if you watch the cutaways with that in mind, as expressions of a character's unwillingness to be direct, they take on a completely different quality. They stop being interruptions and start being confessions. The show was built with a writer's room that MacFarlane assembled carefully in those early seasons. People like Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, and Gary Janetti were part of that original core, and they shared a sensibility that valued emotional specificity beneath the comedy. MacFarlane himself voiced four of the main characters, Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, which meant that in the recording booth, every scene involving those four had a single voice actor doing multiple roles, keeping the emotional register of each character in relationship to the others. The show's score, handled primarily by Walter Murphy, is another layer of this architecture that most people never consciously register. Murphy scored the show with a sophisticated orchestral vocabulary that draws from Bernard Herrmann's thriller work, classic Hollywood romantic scoring, and traditional television incidental music. The score often plays completely straight against scenes that are comedically absurd. And this dissonance, the melodramatic string swells underneath something ridiculous, is not an accident. It is a formal choice that keeps the show emotionally alive even when the surface content is going for a cheap laugh. The music insists quietly that what's happening matters. This is the first and most important thing to understand about Family Guy. It is not a comedy that happens to have emotional moments. It is a drama about grief, disappointment, and the strange endurance of family love that happens to package itself as a comedy because that's the only way the audience would sit still for it. Everything that follows in this video is a close look at the details that prove it. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let us know. Where in the world are you watching this, and what time is it where you are? It's always good to know who's keeping us company at this hour. And if you're finding this kind of deep dive interesting, a subscription means you'll never miss one. Section 2. Peter Griffin's Secret Competence. There is a version of Peter Griffin that the show presents on the surface, and then there is the version that lives just underneath, and those two versions are genuinely different people. The surface Peter is well known. He is overweight, easily distracted, unable to resist an impulse, and possessed of the kind of casual cruelty that passes for humor when it's aimed at the right target. He forgets things. He breaks things. He makes decisions that make no rational sense and defends them with the confidence of a man who has never once been troubled by self-doubt. He is, in the shorthand of animated comedy, the bumbling idiot dad. But watch him carefully. Watch the way he moves through situations that should be entirely beyond his capacity. Watch the moments where his face does something that his dialogue is not doing. Watch the way the show occasionally, quietly, allows him to be right. Peter Griffin is not stupid. He is something more specific and more sad. He is a man who is deeply afraid of being known, and who uses stupidity as a social defense. This reading starts with the origin of the character. MacFarlane based Peter partly on a security guard he knew at the Rhode Island School of Design. A working-class man who navigated a world populated by educated artists and intellectuals by leaning hard into a persona of blunt, unrefined pragmatism. That is a strategy. That is a choice. And the Peter Griffin of the early seasons carries that strategic quality. He often knows more than he lets on. He often understands exactly what is happening, but chooses to respond to it in a way that protects him from having to engage with it fully. Look at the episode A Mission Impossible from Season 3, where Peter has to help Lois through her pregnancy with her sister Carol, and Stewie tries to prevent the birth of a rival. The episode gets a lot of its comedy from Peter being oblivious, but there are several scenes where Peter is clearly tracking the emotional stakes with more precision than his dialogue suggests. When Lois is overwhelmed and Peter holds her without saying anything useful, it is not because he does not understand her distress. It is because he is, in that moment, operating from an emotional intelligence that his verbal intelligence has no framework to express. This is a pattern that runs through the early seasons consistently. Peter understands family dynamics. He understands that Meg needs more from him. He understands that Lois has given things up to be married to him. He understands that his friends see him in specific ways that he performs to rather than challenges. But between understanding a thing and being able to articulate it or act on it, there is a gap that Peter cannot cross, and the show treats that gap with a surprising degree of gentleness. The episode A Fish Out of Water from Season 3 sends Peter and his friends on a fishing trip after Peter buys a boat he cannot afford. The entire premise is built on Peter's impulsivity, his inability to plan, his refusal to think consequences through. But the resolution of the episode hinges on Peter doing something quietly gutsy. He risks the boat he cannot afford to save a man's life at sea, and he does it without hesitation, without commentary, without needing credit for it afterward. That moment is not played for a laugh. It passes quickly, the way real courage usually does, without fanfare. There is a quality to Peter that the show sometimes allows and sometimes abandons, depending on what the episode needs, and that quality is a kind of rough physical fearlessness. He will do physically dangerous things. He will put himself between his family and harm when it comes down to it. In the Season 1 episode I Never Met the Dead Man, when the family is dealing with the fallout of Peter accidentally destroying the town's television cable, there is a scene in which Peter genuinely wrestles with whether he is the cause of harm to people he cares about. That scene is brief and mostly played for irony, but the underlying feeling, a man's slow, uncomfortable recognition that his impulses have consequences for others, is real. The most revealing detail about Peter Griffin's hidden competence is the way he relates to Chris. Peter and Chris have, buried under the mockery and the chaos of their household, one of the most authentic father-son dynamics in animated television. Chris inherited Peter's body, his anxieties about intelligence, his tendency to disappear inside himself. And in their best moments together, Peter treats Chris with a tenderness that he is apparently incapable of performing for an audience, but can manage when it is just the two of them, and the situation is small enough that pretense is unnecessary. In Road to Rupert from Season 5, it is technically a Brian and Stewie episode, but there is a subplot involving Peter and Chris that contains some of the warmest character writing the show ever produced. Peter is trying to get a driver's license, which is embarrassing for him because he does not have one. Chris, who has every reason to mock his father, instead treats the situation with a kind of instinctive loyalty. He protects Peter's dignity without making a point of doing it. And Peter notices. The look he gives Chris in that episode is not the look of a man who does not understand what just happened. It is the look of a man who is surprised, quietly, that he deserves it. The chicken fight is another piece of this puzzle, and it is one of the most misread recurring bits in the show. The giant chicken, named Ernie, appears throughout the series in escalating battles with Peter that grow more elaborate and more cinematic with each iteration. These fights are usually framed as throwaway insanity, and they are certainly that, but they are also something else. They are the show externalizing Peter's relationship with the world of competence and consequence. Ernie is everything that keeps refusing to just stay down when Peter confronts it. He is the bill that keeps coming, the grudge that keeps resurfacing, the fight with the world that never quite resolves. The first chicken fight in Season 2's Da Boom is set off by Ernie giving Peter a coupon that had expired. That is the inciting incident. A coupon. An expired piece of paper that promised Peter something and then couldn't deliver. The fight that results is so massively disproportionate to the cause that it reads is, if you let it, as something about male frustration with a world that constantly overpromises and underdelivers. Peter goes to war with a chicken over a coupon, and the show stages that war with the gravity and production scale of an action sequence. It is absurd. It is also, if you are feeling generous toward it, kind of honest. Peter's relationship with Quagmire, Joe, and Cleveland at the Drunken Clam is built on a dynamic that the show rarely makes explicit but always honors. These men are each other's emotional infrastructure. The bar is not just a place they drink. It is the place where they can be approximately themselves without consequence. The jokes they make, the complaints they air, the stories they tell, these are the rituals of people who do not have another vocabulary for intimacy. They cannot say to each other, "I need you here tonight." So instead they say, "Let me tell you about the weirdest thing that happened to me this week." And they stay. That is not nothing. That is actually the thing. Peter's most unguarded moments happen when he thinks no one is assigning them meaning. He sings in the car. He cries at movies and then immediately denies it. He talks to animals with a softness completely absent from his interactions with adult humans. These are not jokes added to his character for comic relief. They are the show's way of keeping Peter's interior life accessible, even when his exterior has been pushed to a place of cartoon villainy. Even in the seasons where the writing pushed Peter into territory that was genuinely hard to defend, these small private gestures persisted. They were the handhold the audience could use to stay connected to him. The most poignant detail in Peter's characterization is also the most easily missed. He never stops trying to make Lois laugh. Through every season, through every argument, through every catastrophe he causes and every mess he fails to clean up, Peter finds ways to reach for Lois specifically through humor. Not through apology, not through explanation, not through the kind of direct emotional conversation that would require him to be vulnerable, through making her laugh. Because making someone laugh is the most intimate thing Peter knows how to do, and it is the language through which his love most clearly moves. The show frames this as a quirk, and sometimes as manipulation, but watch it over the span of years and it accumulates into something that resembles a portrait. A man who learned somewhere along the way that if he could make people laugh at him, they could not be hurt by him. And who then spent the rest of his life not quite being able to outgrow that lesson, even when he wanted to. Section 3. Brian Griffin's Tragedy. Brian Griffin is one of the great tragic characters in animated television. And the tragedy is that most people who watch the show saw only the parts of him that were easy to dislike. The surface-level case against Brian is well established. He drinks too much. He name-drops books and films he wants to seem like he's deeply engaged with, but rarely finishes. He treats his romantic relationships like auditions for a role no one has cast. He talks about writing a novel the way certain people talk about exercise, with tremendous conviction and very little actual effort. He is, in the shorthand of the later seasons, a fraud. But the fraud diagnosis, while not inaccurate in the later seasons, misses what was actually being written in the early years, and what made Brian's eventual decline not just disappointing, but specifically devastating for anyone who was paying close attention. In the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, Brian Griffin is a character about the quiet suffering of the almost enough person. He is intelligent enough to know what good work looks like, but not quite able to produce it. He is self-aware enough to see his own flaws clearly, but not disciplined enough to address them. He cares about people with a depth that occasionally breaks through his studied detachment, and those moments of genuine care make everything around them look more stark by comparison. He is also, in those early seasons, deeply lonely in a way the show treats with remarkable care. The Brian of Season 1 is not the reclusive intellectual he will sometimes pretend to be later. He is engaged. He is interested in the people around him. He talks to Stewie, really talks, in a way none of the other adults in the house do, because he is curious about Stewie's inner life, not because he wants to score philosophical points. When Peter does something reckless and Brian objects, the objection does not come from a place of superiority. It comes from a place of genuine concern. He does not want Peter to get hurt. He does not want the people he loves to suffer consequences they did not need to walk into. The episode A Mission Impossible gives Brian a scene that is easy to miss but worth returning to. When Lois is overwhelmed, Brian is the one who stays. Not with a solution, not with advice, just present. It is the kind of emotional support that asks nothing and costs everything, and Brian offers it without commentary. That is not the behavior of a narcissist, that is the behavior of someone who knows how to love but has no idea how to accept it in return. Brian's novel, the one he spends years claiming to be writing without ever finishing, is the spine of his character in the early seasons, and it is handled with more nuance than most comedies would bother with. The joke is that he cannot finish it, but the underlying reality is that finishing it would require him to commit to a vision of himself as an artist, and Brian is afraid of that commitment in a way he is unable to articulate even to himself. The unfinished novel is not laziness, it is protection. If the novel is never finished, it can never be rejected. If it is never rejected, Brian can keep the identity without having to test it. This is a psychologically real thing. This is how creative paralysis actually works. And the show embeds it in a talking dog in an animated comedy and then never makes a dramatic scene out of it, which is exactly the right call. The Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie stands apart from everything else the show produced. It aired as the 150th episode of the series on May 2nd, 2010. The entire episode takes place in a bank vault over a weekend. There are no cutaway gags. There is no music. There is no subplot. It is 30 minutes of two characters talking to each other with enough honesty to make you forget you are watching an animated comedy. The moment at the center of the episode is Brian's revelation that the safety deposit box, which Stewie assumed contained money or documents, contains a gun and a bottle of scotch. When Stewie realizes what that means, that Brian keeps those things there in case he ever decides he does not want to live anymore, and asks why, Brian's answer is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of dialogue the show ever produced. He talks about not being able to find meaning, about feeling like he is reaching towards something he cannot name, with hands that keep coming back empty. He says, without melodrama, that he just is not sure what the point is. The episode received mostly positive reviews and drew 7.68 million viewers. Psychology Today ran a piece using the episode as a case study in how to talk to a friend who is struggling. The show had used its most beloved comedy double act to make a piece of television about existential emptiness and the terrifying fragility of people you think you know. And then, the following week, Brian was back to making wine recommendations and embarrassing himself in front of women. That is the tragedy of Brian Griffin, not the later Flanderization, though that was its own separate loss. The tragedy is that the show built a character with this kind of interior architecture and then kept him inside a format that could not fully honor what had been built. The Vault episode is a proof of concept, a demonstration of what Brian was capable of being. And the fact that it stands alone, unrepeated, surrounded by episodes in which Brian behaves like a cartoon of himself, makes it feel less like a chapter and more like a window into a room that stayed locked. Brian's love for Lois, which the show acknowledges and then puts away and then occasionally takes back out again, is another piece of his hidden interior life. In the early seasons, it is handled with a delicacy that is genuinely surprising. Brian does not leer. He does not scheme. He carries a feeling that he has concluded is not actionable, and he carries it with the particular dignity of someone who has decided that loving a person does not require them to do anything about it. That is a sophisticated emotional position for any character to hold, let alone a comic relief talking dog in an animated sitcom. His relationship with Stewie, which becomes the emotional center of the show in the middle seasons, is built on a mutual recognition that I think gets undersold in most discussions of the show. Brian sees Stewie clearly, not as a villain, not as a baby, not even as the prodigy he presents himself as, but as a profoundly lonely child who has constructed an elaborate identity to manage a world that does not see him properly. And Brian, who has done something structurally similar, responds to that with a fellow feeling that does not need to be explained or justified. When Stewie in the Vault episode tells Brian that Brian is his only friend, and that Brian gives his life purpose, it lands so hard because the show has earned it. Every scene of Brian reading to Stewie, every road trip they take together, every conversation where neither of them says the fully true thing, but both of them know what is not being said. It all accumulates into a relationship that is, quietly, the most honest thing in the show. The road trip episodes, the road to series that the show produced across multiple seasons, are Brian and Stewie at their best, which is to say, at the show's best. Road to Rhode Island, Road to Europe, Road to the North Pole, Road to the Multiverse. Each of these episodes strips away the Griffin family backdrop and places these two characters alone in a situation that requires them to rely on each other. And the result is always a show that is simultaneously funnier and more emotionally resonant than its regular episodes. The road to format is Family Guy with the constraints loosened just enough to let the characters breathe. In Road to the North Pole, Brian and Stewie discover the bleak reality behind the myth of Santa Claus, and the episode ends with Stewie helping a broken, exhausted, physically deteriorating Santa deliver gifts, while Brian goes door to door in the snow. It is played for black comedy, but it is also genuinely moving. The two of them, small and cold and keeping each other going through a night that has cost them more than they expected. It is a portrait of friendship as endurance, as choosing to finish the thing you started even when it stopped being fun. Brian's tragedy is that he always knew what mattered. He just could not consistently be the person who acted like he knew it. Section 4. Stewie's Inner World. To understand what Stewie Griffin is actually about, you have to start not with the world domination plots or the British accent or the laser guns built in the nursery, but with the particular specific horror of being a baby. Not an evil baby, just a baby. You are 1 year old. You are conscious in ways that none of the adults around you can detect or credit. You understand language, you understand social dynamics, you understand the difference between how people treat you and how they treat each other. You have preferences and desires and a rich interior life. And you are completely, totally, structurally dependent on people who either cannot hear you or choose not to. You live at the mercy of others in a way that no adult ever has to live. You are fed when they decide you are hungry. You sleep when they decide it is time. Your body is managed by strangers in the most intimate possible way. That is the premise of Stewie Griffin. Not the evil genius premise. That is the costume. The premise underneath is about radical powerlessness disguised as radical power. The world domination dreams are not really about wanting to dominate the world. They are about a child who has no control over anything in his actual environment and who has responded by constructing an internal world in which he has total control over everything. The weapons are real in the show's logic, but they are also on the level at which the show operates as emotional storytelling, a child's fantasy of autonomy. The plans for world conquest are the plans of someone who cannot decide when his own meals happen. Stewie's obsession with killing Lois in the early seasons is the most extreme expression of this. It has been interpreted as pure dark comedy, and it is that, but it is also a piece of child psychology rendered in animated form. The parent who controls everything, who is omnipresent, who is both the source of everything good and the agent of total dependency. The ambivalence that infants feel toward caregivers is well documented in developmental psychology. The show takes that ambivalence and runs it out to its most absurd logical conclusion. The baby who hates and loves his mother simultaneously. The baby who fantasizes about destroying the person he cannot live without. The comedy of Stewie's early seasons works precisely because the show maintains two registers at once. In the world of the show, Stewie is genuinely dangerous. His plans are real, his weapons function, his intelligence is extraordinary. But in the emotional register underneath the plot, he is also just a baby who wants his mother to look at him and see something remarkable. The scene from the Season 1 episode Chitty Chitty Death Bang, where Stewie fakes being happy and sweet to get what he wants from Lois, works on both levels simultaneously. On one level, it is a villain being manipulative. On another level, it is a child performing the version of himself that earns approval. Every parent watching that scene has seen it. Every adult who remembers being a child has felt something in it. The moments of genuine vulnerability that appear in Stewie's storylines throughout the series, his fear of abandonment, his desperate need for approval from people whose approval he publicly disdains, his attachment to his stuffed bear Rupert that goes so far beyond the comedy premise of a baby with a favorite toy, are all pieces of this interior world the show built beneath the cartoon villainy. Rupert is worth dwelling on. Rupert is a brown teddy bear, and in the early seasons, he appears as a prop, a sight gag, an object in the background of Stewie's nursery. But across the seasons, Stewie's relationship with Rupert becomes something that the show treats with an earnestness that is both funny and genuinely touching. Stewie talks to Rupert, not performs talking to Rupert for comic effect, but has real conversations with him, processes his feelings through the bear, uses the relationship with the toy as a way of holding emotional content that he cannot yet put words to. This is not a gag, or rather, it is a gag that is also a portrait of how children actually manage interior life. The episode Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, which aired across season 4 as a direct-to-video release before being broken into episodes, contains a sequence where Stewie briefly gets a glimpse of his adult self and is crushed by what he sees. The adult Stewie he encounters is not a world conqueror. He is not a villain. He is a fairly ordinary, somewhat unhappy person living a quiet life. And Stewie's reaction to this, his horror at the ordinariness of the future he is apparently heading toward, is one of the funnier and more interesting moments the show produced in that era because it takes the world domination premise seriously enough to ask what happens when the world dominator does not dominate the world. The answer, it turns out, is that he becomes just a person. And somehow that is the worst fate. Stewie's gradual softening across the seasons, the transition from evil genius to emotionally expressive, creatively engaged, identity-exploring young person, is often framed as a betrayal of the original character. And in purely comedic terms, something was definitely lost. There was nothing else on television like the evil baby. When the show drifted away from that, it left a vacancy that nothing else could fill. But the emotional journey of that softening contains something that the pure villain version of Stewie could not contain: actual development. The later Stewie is a character who is learning who he is. He is trying on identities: the cross-dressing, the theatrical performances, the fashion obsessions, the romantic experiments. And the show treats all of this not as a punchline, but as a process. He is, in the later seasons, a character genuinely in the middle of becoming someone. And the show has the intelligence to be out to know that this is interesting even if it is less immediately funny than a baby with a death ray. The friendship with Brian, which becomes the primary vehicle for Stewie's emotional life from season 4 onward, is built on a paradox. Stewie, the character supposedly defined by cold ambition and ruthless scheming, turns out to need warmth more than almost anyone else in the family. His attachment to Brian is not strategic. It is not a manipulation. It is the attachment of a child who has found one person who actually talks to him and who has decided, with the total commitment of a very small person, that this is the relationship worth protecting. The scene in Christmas Guy, season 12, where Stewie uses a time travel device to save Brian from being hit by the car that killed him, traveling back to that specific moment and intervening at personal risk, is framed as a Christmas miracle, but its emotional logic is about something much more basic. It is a child deciding that there are some losses he refuses to accept, that there are some things worth the cost of any action required to prevent them. The writers understood that the character who most seemed to not need anyone was actually the character who needed someone most. That is the inside of Stewie Griffin. Section 5. Meg Griffin's Hidden Narrative. Meg Griffin is, by a significant margin, the most misread character in Family Guy. The standard account of Meg is that she starts as a relatable but unremarkable teenager, and is then gradually transformed into the show's punching bag. A vessel for abuse, an object of mockery, a character whose function is to absorb the family's worst impulses so that the rest of the Griffins can remain nominally functional. That account is accurate as a description of what the show does to her, but it is not an account of what the show is about when it does it. Because Meg Griffin, watched carefully across the whole span of the series, is the show's most sustained meditation on invisibility, on the specific kind of suffering that comes from being present but unseen, on the question of what it costs a person to remain in relationships that do not offer adequate recognition in exchange for enormous emotional labor. In the first 3 seasons, Meg is the ordinary one. This is clearly intentional. In a household that contains a man with the impulse control of a large toddler, a self-actualized infant world conqueror, and a talking dog who went to Brown, the teenager who just wants to be invited to the right parties is the normal one. The joke of her normality in those early seasons is gentle and specific. She is less interesting than her family, not because there is something wrong with her, but because the family she was born into has set the bar for interesting at a height that ordinary adolescents cannot clear. But Meg is not actually ordinary. She is just quiet. She is a person with real desires and real intelligence and real aesthetic sensibilities. She plays instruments, she writes, she has a genuine emotional range, who has learned that none of these things attract the right kind of attention in her house. So she leads with the version of herself that matches the expectation, which is the version that is easy to dismiss. And then she is dismissed, which confirms the theory, which makes her lead even harder with the dismissible version. This is a loop, and the show, at its most honest, knows that it is a loop. The season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party is the closest the show ever comes to breaking the loop explicitly. In this episode, which takes place during a hurricane, Meg finally says out loud what she has been accumulating for years. She addresses each member of her family directly and delivers an indictment that is specific, accurate, and devastating. She tells Peter what he is. She tells Lois what she is. She names the dynamic that has been operating in the background of the show for a decade. And then the episode does something that enraged a large portion of the audience. Meg takes it back. She goes to Brian and explains that she cannot let herself be seen because the family falls apart without her as the designated target. She accepts the role she was given because the alternative, a family that cannot function without her suffering, is somehow worse than a family that functions because of it. This ending was genuinely controversial and is frequently cited as one of the most troubling pieces of writing the show ever produced. The complaint is that it tells victims to accept their victimhood for the stability of the abuser, and that complaint is not unfair. But there is another way to read that ending, not as an endorsement of what Meg chooses, but as a portrait of how entrenched family dynamics actually work. The show is not saying that Meg should accept being the target. The show is showing you exactly what the cost of not accepting it looks like. The family's complete inability to manage its own toxicity without a designated outlet, and asking you to sit with the horror of that. The ending of Seahorse Seashell Party is not comfortable. It is not meant to be comfortable. It is meant to be the feeling you get when you understand that some systems of harm are so deeply embedded that even the person being harmed participates in their maintenance because the alternative looks even worse. That is not a comedy observation. That is a clinical description of how dysfunctional family systems operate. Meg's recurring attempts to form relationships outside the family, her crushes, her friendships, her desperate and usually failed bids for social inclusion at school, are the show's way of demonstrating that she is not broken in any essential way. She wants what people want. She has the capacity for connection. The problem is not inside her. It is surrounding her. The episode where Meg befriends the popular crowd and starts becoming someone else in order to fit in, only to be discarded the moment her usefulness runs out, is one of the show's clearest articulations of what it is actually doing with her character. She is not just the unlucky one. She is a character whose entire arc is about learning to survive in an environment that provides her none of the things a person needs to develop confidence in who they are. What makes Meg's hidden narrative so rich and so difficult is that she is also allowed occasional moments of genuine power. There are episodes scattered through the later seasons where Meg is competent, where she is morally clear, where she acts with a directness and certainty that makes the other Griffins look blurry by comparison. These moments, brief, unrepeated, easily missed, are the show reminding you that Meg could be someone, if the people around her would let her. The Simpsons crossover episode, in which Meg meets Lisa Simpson and the two of them form a genuine friendship built on mutual recognition of each other's gifts, is one of the most touching pieces of television either show produced in their middle years. Lisa sees Meg and tells her she is remarkable, and Meg, for about 20 minutes of television, is allowed to believe it. Watching the moment when Meg receives genuine recognition from an outside source is unexpectedly moving, because the show has spent so long showing you exactly what the absence of that recognition does to a person. Mila Kunis took over the voice of Meg beginning in Season 2, and she brought to the character a specific quality of controlled sadness that makes even the comedy of Meg's most difficult moments register with an additional weight. There is always something underneath Kunis's performance of Meg that sounds like a person trying very hard to hold something together. It is not something you hear consciously, but it shapes every scene. Meg Griffin is the show's conscience. She is the character who knows what is happening, who names it when she is allowed to name it, who absorbs the dissonance between what this family says it is and what it actually does. The show could not sustain itself without her in that role. She is, paradoxically, the most essential character in a show that made its comedic signature her apparent dispensability. Section 6. The Lois Problem. Lois Griffin is the character who got away with the most in Family Guy, in large part because she got away with it slowly, across years, in increments small enough that each individual moment could be chalked up to the demands of a specific episode rather than recognized as part of a larger portrait. She is the most complex character in the show. She is also, in specific seasons, the most troubling. And both of those things are true for the same reason. Lois was built from the beginning as something deceptively stable. She is the reasonable one. She is the adult in the room. When Peter does something catastrophic, Lois is there to react to it with appropriate exasperation while quietly keeping the family from actually falling apart. In the first two seasons, this role is performed with enough warmth that it functions as a genuine characterization. Lois loves Peter. It is strange and specific and sometimes inexplicable love. But it is real, and Alex Borstein voices it with a quality that makes the strange, specific, inexplicable love feel completely earned. But Lois is also, from almost the first episode, a person with a secret interior. She comes from the Pewterschmidt family, one of the wealthiest in Rhode Island. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is an old-money patrician who has never fully accepted Peter as worthy of his daughter. The marriage between Lois and Peter is already, at the level of backstory, a defection. She chose this life. She walked away from privilege and into something more chaotic, more honest, more alive. And the show, to its credit, does not fully romanticize that choice. It asks occasionally what it cost. There are episodes scattered through the series where Lois is allowed to be someone other than the reasonable wife and mother, usually comedic episodes built around a different aspect of her character, but containing within them a genuine emotional honesty about the specific frustrations of a woman who gave up a particular kind of life to have a different particular kind of life, and who lives with the arithmetic of that trade daily. The episode Model Misbehavior from Season 4 puts Lois back in the world of fashion modeling, a career she had before her marriage. The episode plays it for comedy. Lois becomes obsessed with fitness and appearance. Peter reacts with jealousy and insecurity. But the underlying note is about the return of a self that marriage and motherhood required her to set aside. When Lois looks in the mirror in that episode and sees the version of herself that existed before Spooner Street, the show is asking something it will not always ask so directly. What do you give up, and is it worth it? Lois's relationship with sexuality is handled across the series with more frankness than most primetime network shows would attempt. She is depicted as someone with desires that her marriage does not always adequately address. She is attracted to men who are not her husband. She is interested in herself in ways that go beyond the domestic. The show sometimes plays this for shock and sometimes plays it for genuine characterization. And when it does the latter, the result is a portrait of a married woman trying to hold on to an identity that domesticity keeps trying to dissolve. Her friendship with Bonnie Swanson, Joe's wife, is one of the show's most underwritten relationships. But even in its limited iterations, it speaks to the specific experience of women in marriages that center around their husbands' needs and personalities. Lois and Bonnie are both defined largely by their relationships to their husbands. Their friendship is the space where they get to exist slightly outside of that. The show does not develop this enough. It never quite gives Lois and Bonnie the depth their friendship implies. But the gesture toward it is present and consistent. The Pewterschmidt family is the key to understanding Lois's most complicated moments. Her father, Carter, is a man who measures everything in dollars and whose affection for Lois is tangled up with his disappointment at her choices. Her mother, Barbara, is a woman who survived her husband's emotional opacity by developing a refined capacity for not looking directly at things. These people shaped Lois before Peter ever entered the picture, and the behaviors that Lois exhibits in the series, the occasional coldness toward Meg, the capacity for self-deception, the way she sometimes participates in the household's dysfunction rather than simply managing it, make more sense in the context of where she came from. One of the more quietly devastating details in Lois's characterization is the consistent hint that she sees in Meg something she recognizes from herself at that age. A person trying too hard to be wanted in an environment that will not give them what they need. And instead of using that recognition to reach toward Meg, Lois often recoils from it. Because looking at Meg means looking at something about herself that she has spent a long time not looking at. That is not a cartoon mother. That is a person. The music in Lois's storylines is worth noting separately. Whenever the show builds a scene around Lois's piano playing, and it does this more than casual viewers register, the scoring shifts. The show uses piano prominently in its incidental music, and when it is foregrounded as something Lois is performing, rather than just something in the background, the tone of the scenes around it changes. Piano is the instrument associated with Lois's earlier self, the self that existed before Peter and the kids and Spooner Street. When she plays, she is briefly back inside something that belongs only to her. Alex Borstein voices Lois with a quality that has deepened consistently across the show's run. The early Borstein performance is warm and centered, a counterweight to the chaos. But in the middle seasons, something more interesting appears. A slight edge, a flash of impatience with the very framework she inhabits. A voice that is trying to hold more than the words it is saying. This is an actor finding the real person inside the function and trusting that it will register, even in an animated comedy, even if no one in the writer's room ever quite asked her to go there. Lois is the show's acknowledgement that the glue holding a family together is doing invisible work, and that the person doing that work is not the same person she was before she was doing it. She chose this family. She keeps choosing it. But choice is not the same as completion. She is still reaching towards something, still playing the piano, still occasionally stepping back into the world that existed before she married Peter Griffin, and the show honors that reaching even when it cannot fully follow it. Section 7. Quagmire, Cleveland, and Joe. The three men who drink with Peter at the Drunken Clam are almost universally discussed as comic support, as the outer ring of the show's comedy machinery rather than as fully realized people. This is a mistake, and the show knows it is a mistake, which is why it keeps giving these three characters episodes and moments that push back against the function they are usually assigned. Glenn Quagmire is the most surprising of the three. On the surface, Quagmire is a joke about male sexuality. He is reflexively, almost compulsively, interested in women. His catchphrase is an expression of sexual enthusiasm. His backstory, when it accumulates across episodes, is a map of relationships that never lasted and attractions that never stabilized into anything permanent. He is the show's externalization of a particular kind of masculine energy, the relentless pursuit of connection through sexual activity, which is a way of pursuing connection while maintaining the appearance of not needing it. But Quagmire has backstory, real backstory, the kind that lands differently when you return to his comedic moments with it in mind. His father is Dan Quagmire, a Vietnam War veteran and naval officer of genuine distinction, who turns out to be a woman in a man's body, someone who spent decades living as someone they were not, someone who served heroically while carrying a private truth that could not yet be spoken. When Quagmire learns this about his father in the Season 8 episode Quagmire's Dad, the show gives him something genuinely difficult to process. He is not immediately accepting. He struggles. He pushes back. But the episode is not structured to mock his struggle. It is structured to show a person trying to expand the frame of who their parent is, which is one of the harder emotional tasks any adult child faces. The implication that runs underneath Quagmire's entire characterization, visible once you know his father's story, is that Glenn Quagmire grew up in a household with a secret at its center. He grew up watching a parent perform a gender identity they did not feel, watching masculinity performed as protection rather than expression, watching someone who could not afford to be who they actually were. And then Glenn became, in his adult life, someone defined entirely by the most surface-level performance of masculine desire, as if he learned, from watching his father, that the inside is where things get complicated, and the outside is where you go to survive. His sister Brenda, who appears in the episode Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q, is in an abusive relationship. The episode is one of the darkest and most formally unusual things Family Guy ever produced. A family sitcom doing something close to a domestic violence after-school special, shot with a visual sobriety that is completely at odds with the show's usual register. Quagmire's response to his sister's situation, including the ultimately lethal choice he makes to end the threat to her, is handled with a seriousness that places it outside the normal comedy framework of the show entirely. These two episodes, Quagmire's Dad and Screams of Silence, build a picture of Glenn Quagmire as a man whose comedic persona is a shell built over a very specific set of accumulated experiences, a complicated family history, a deep vein of protectiveness toward people he considers under threat, and a need for connection that his casual sexual behavior continuously gestures toward and continuously fails to satisfy. The moment in the episode, Jerome is the New Black, Season 8, where Quagmire delivers his famous speech to Brian about exactly why he cannot stand him, is more interesting than the comedy of it suggests. On the surface, it functions as a takedown. Quagmire cataloging Brian's hypocrisy, his pretension, his failure to live up to the image he presents of himself. But there is something in the specificity and the heat of that speech that suggests Quagmire recognizes in Brian a particular kind of fraudulence because he has reason to understand it. A man who presents one face and lives another. He knows that type. He grew up with it. Cleveland Brown is the most frequently underestimated character in Family Guy's central group. He is the steady one, the patient one, the man whose emotional register is so regulated that other characters sometimes read him as having no emotional register at all. But the show uses Cleveland's steadiness not as blankness, but as contrast. His calm exists in relationship to the volatility around him, and it carries within it the particular history of a man who learned early that restraint is a survival strategy. Cleveland's arc over the run of the show, including his spin-off period and his return to Family Guy, is one of the more complete character journeys in the animation block. He is a man who went through a marriage that ended in infidelity. His ex-wife Loretta left him for Quagmire, which is a specific kind of humiliation involving a friend, and who then built a new life and found a new partnership and carried what happened with him into that new life without letting it corrupt everything. There is an episode in the early seasons where Cleveland reacts to Peter's antics with a gentleness that is almost parental, and the camera lingers on Cleveland's face in a way that is unusual for the show, holding the shot long enough for something to be communicated that the dialogue is not saying. Cleveland is watching a friend he loves act out in a way Cleveland understands is about pain, and he is making the choice to stay instead of pulling away. That is not a comic beat. That is character. Joe Swanson occupies a unique position in animated television. He is one of the very few recurring disabled characters in a mainstream adult animated series, and the show does not reduce him to his disability, even when it uses his disability as the source of comedy. The first episode that introduced Joe, a hero sits next door from Season 1, established him immediately as someone who commanded respect, a man whose injury was part of his story, but not the story. The neighborhood admired Joe before they knew about his paralysis. They admired him because of who he was. The show revisits Joe's injury across multiple episodes, and the backstories are not always consistent. The show's continuity is famously loose, but what remains consistent is Joe's relationship to his own identity. He does not define himself by what he cannot do. He defines himself by what he is: a police officer, a husband, a father, a friend. When episodes come that threaten those definitions, when his marriage strains, when his job puts him in conflict with his friends, when his disability becomes the center of a scene in a way he did not choose, Joe's responses are calibrated to those specific threats rather than to the disability itself. The episode where Joe briefly regains the ability to walk and discovers that walking changes him in ways he does not want to be changed is one of the show's most interesting and least talked about moments. He chooses to return to the wheelchair, not because he cannot have legs, but because the person he is with legs is not the person he wants to be. The episode does not announce that this is a profound statement about identity and disability. It just shows a man making a choice about who he is, and lets that choice speak. These three men, Glenn, Cleveland, Joe, are the outer architecture of the show's emotional world. They are the community that the Griffin family is embedded in, the witnesses to the family's chaos, the standard against which the Griffin household's particular variety of dysfunction can be measured. And the show understands that witnesses have their own interiority. That the people watching the chaos are also living lives, carrying weight, navigating things the chaos of the foreground does not leave room to examine. Section 8. The cutaway as commentary. The cutaway gag is the most analyzed formal feature in Family Guy, and it has been analyzed mostly wrong. The standard analysis goes like this. Cutaway gags replace storytelling. They are the show's way of filling time with disconnected jokes. When the main plot runs thin, they are, in their most degenerate form, a signal that the writers have run out of things to say about the characters and are reaching for the first random thing that comes to mind. South Park's Trey Parker and Matt Stone formalized this critique in their 2006 two-part episode Cartoon Wars, depicting Family Guy's joke generation process as a group of manatees pushing random idea balls together to form non sequiturs. The critique landed hard partly because it was funny, and partly because in the seasons that had already aired by 2006, there was real evidence for it. But the critique is an analysis of the cutaway in its degraded form. In its original and best form, the cutaway gag does something much stranger and more interesting than random humor insertion. The cutaway, in the early seasons of Family Guy, functions as a form of externalized free association. When a character references something and the show cuts away to show it, the quality of what the show shows you tells you something about the character's interior state that the character themselves is not expressing directly. The association is not random. The association is chosen, and the choice is telling. Consider how the cutaways work in Peter's storylines. Peter references something, a past experience, an observation, a comparison, and the cutaway expresses it in a form that is often more honest about Peter's psychology than his dialogue is. He compares something to a time when he was humiliated, and the cutaway shows him being humiliated. He references something about his childhood, and the cutaway is darker than the comedy requires. He deflects from an emotional truth with an absurd joke, and the cutaway is the absurd joke delivered in a way that contains the emotional truth anyway. This is not an accident. McFarlane and his original writer's room were doing something specific. They were using the cutaway as the show's equivalent of a character's unspoken thought, the thing the character would say if they were willing to say it, rendered instead as visual comedy that gives everyone involved plausible deniability. The cutaway also functions as a kind of democratic access to information. It tells the audience things about the show's world that the characters cannot or do not articulate. When the show cuts to a piece of history or a cultural reference or a parody of something outside the show's fictional world, it is creating a shared space between the audience and the narrator, a space that exists above the action and comments on it obliquely. Think about the specific cultural references the show gravitates toward in its cutaways. In the early seasons, there is a heavy lean toward 1970s and 1980s popular culture. Saturday Night Fever, Star Wars, The Dukes of Hazzard, Knight Rider, the variety show circuit. This is not just nostalgia. This is the world as Peter Griffin experienced it in formative years. The cutaways that emerge from Peter's dialogue are filtered through Peter's particular cultural memory, and that memory is dense with the specific cultural productions of a working-class New England childhood in the late 70s and early 80s. When Brian's dialogue triggers a cutaway, the cultural references shift. They become more literary, more cinematic in an art house sense, more interested in music and performance. Brian's cutaways inhabit a different cultural stratum than Peter's, and the show uses this difference consistently. The cutaway is not just a joke delivery mechanism. It is a window into a character's cultural identity, and cultural identity is one of the ways the show distinguishes characters who might otherwise blend into each other. The show's musical cutaways are a specific and underappreciated category. Family Guy uses music with more sophistication than most animated comedies. The show's team, working with composer Walter Murphy and his orchestral arrangements, built a musical vocabulary that spans Broadway show tunes, classic Hollywood film scoring, jazz standards, big band, and original comedy songs. When the show cuts to a musical performance, and it does this regularly across its run, the choice of musical form is always meaningful. The production number, This House is Freakin' Sweet, from the second season premiere Peter Caviar Eater, is a perfect example. The Griffin family inherits a mansion, and the show responds with a fully staged theatrical number. Chorus dancers, elaborate choreography, real orchestration, the kind of thing that belongs in a Broadway production. On one level, it is parody of the form, but it is also an expression of something genuinely felt. The Griffin family experiencing abundance for the first time, experiencing the feeling of the world expanding to accommodate them, and the show honoring that feeling with the musical form that is most associated with that specific kind of joy. Stewie's musical numbers are another category unto themselves. Stewie sings with a technical mastery that is entirely incongruous with being an infant, and the songs he chooses to perform, or the songs the show gives him to perform, are frequently about yearning, about wanting more than what is available, about the gap between aspiration and reality. There is a quality of controlled melancholy in many of the songs assigned to Stewie, even when the lyrics are deliberately comic. McFarlane voices Stewie with genuine vocal skill. He is a trained singer with multiple big band albums to his name, and when he brings that skill to Stewie's performance, the effect is genuinely affecting. The Conway Twitty cutaways, which became one of the show's most famous running bits, are interesting precisely because of how many people found them both unfunny and compelling. The show would cut to an extended performance of a Conway Twitty song, not clipped, not parodied, the actual song, played mostly out in full, and audiences sat with it, uncertain what to feel. This is the cutaway in its most alienating form. Not a joke, not a parody, just a document of something that exists inserted into the show's timeline in place of comedy. The Conway Twitty bits have been read as laziness, and sometimes they were. But they are also, in their strangest iterations, functioning as something like the show's subconscious. Conway Twitty sang romantic country music about love and longing and the specific textures of emotional need. His songs are about people trying to communicate feelings they cannot quite reach. The show was cutting away to something that expressed, in a register completely different from the surrounding comedy, the emotional content that the scenes around the cutaway were about. Whether that was the intention or a happy accident of the format, it does not matter. The effect is the same. The show's most famous instance of alleged laziness is also, if you let it be, one of its stranger and more honest formal choices. Section 9. Death, Grief, and Consequences. Family Guy has killed more people than most dramas, and it has done something with some of those deaths that drama rarely manages. It has used them to say something true about grief and loss and the way people fail to process the endings of things. The show's relationship with death is complex in ways that its reputation as a shock comedy does not fully prepare you for. Yes, there is cartoon violence. Yes, there are deaths played purely for laughs, deaths that are reveled in, deaths that the show treats as setups for punchlines. This is all true and frequently uncomfortable. But running alongside those deaths, sometimes in the same episodes, there is a strain of treatment that is genuinely careful. The episode Brian Wallows and Peter Swallows from Season 3 is the earliest and most complete example. Brian is assigned to visit an elderly shut-in named Pearl Burton through a community service obligation, and their relationship moves from hostile to tender across the episode. Pearl, who has been isolated from life and from pleasure, gradually opens up under Brian's company. She begins to live again, cautiously, in the small ways that are available to her. And then she is hit by a truck and killed. McFarlane himself identified this episode as one that contained, in his words, real emotional content. The scene in which Brian and Pearl watch an imagined future together through a virtual reality device, the future they might have had if she had more time, if the world had given them more room, is handled with a gentleness that is genuinely unexpected from this show. They see themselves traveling, they see Pearl meeting Brian's friends, they see a life that exists only in this imagined version of time. And the show lets the sequence breathe without commentary or irony. When Pearl dies after being hit by the truck, quickly, randomly, in the way that real accidental death works, Brian's grief is quiet and specific. He does not make a speech. He does not have a breakdown. He just stands there, and the show holds on him standing there, and the silence communicates everything the comedy will not say. This is the show at its best with mortality, not announcing itself, not underlining the emotion, just staying present with it long enough for the audience to feel the weight without being told that they should. The death of Brian himself in the season 12 episode Life of Brian generated an enormous reaction when it aired in November 2013. The episode killed Brian. He was hit by a car outside the house on Spooner Street, and the family's grief in the aftermath was treated with unusual seriousness. The Griffins mourned Brian with specificity. They each lost something particular to them. And Stewie, who lost his closest friend, was not played for comedy in these scenes. He was played for grief. The episode ended with a new dog, Vinny, being brought into the household, a replacement for Brian that the show was clearly presenting as a replacement that could not replace. Vinny was warmer than Brian in some ways, simpler, more straightforwardly affectionate. But he was not Brian, and the family knew it, and the audience knew it, and the episode trusted that knowledge to generate its emotion. 2 episodes later, in Christmas Guy, Stewie used a time travel device to go back and save Brian. The reversal was almost universally described as a cheap rating stunt, and in commercial terms it probably was. But there is something in the specific mechanism of the reversal that is worth looking at. Stewie, the character who lost the most in Brian's death, is the one who acts. He uses the most extraordinary technology available to him, the technology that defines his identity as a genius inventor, to undo the single most unbearable consequence of the world, continuing to move forward without accommodating what he needed. That is not a plot gimmick. That is a portrait of how grief makes people want impossible things and what people are willing to do when those impossible things become briefly possible. The deaths of minor characters across the show's run are handled with a consistency that tells you something about the show's values, even when the comedy context makes them hard to identify as values. Pearl Burton's death matters. The show spends time on it. Cleveland's brief death gag in the bathtub is a recurring bit that treats the specific physical vulnerability of a man's daily routine with an absurdist seriousness. Even Ernie the Giant Chicken, who Peter battles across episodes in escalating movie-scale fights, ends each encounter in a state of ambiguity. Neither fully dead nor fully alive, suspended at the edge of consequence. The death of Meg's fish in the Season 1 episode Mind Over Murder is a small moment, and entirely played for laughs and context, but it is also the show's earliest signal about Meg's relationship to loss. She grieves in proportion. She responds to the small death of something she cared for with the feelings you are supposed to have. And the family around her has already, by this point in the first season, begun the habit of not taking her grief seriously. The fish dies. Meg is sad and the camera moves on, the way the family will move on, as it always does from Meg's particular species of suffering. The show returned to serious death and consequence territory in the episode about Stewie and the Time Machine from Season 5, and in the Stewie Kills Lois two-parter from Season 6. These episodes, which staged the deaths of major characters in ways that were treated with dramatic weight before being undone by twist mechanics, established a pattern that the show would use repeatedly and that would eventually undermine the emotional impact of all death-related storylines. The first time a major character death is undone by a twist, it is a formal choice. The second time, it is a strategy. The third time, it is a guarantee that future deaths mean nothing. But even within that pattern, the show produced individual moments that were handled with enough care to stand apart from the structural problem. The Season 7 episode where Brian learns he might have fathered a child, the episode about the possibility of an outside consequence to his lifestyle choices, catching up with him, handles the emotional weight of potential parenthood with a nuance that the comedy framing does not entirely swallow. The show also grapples with grief in its relationship to memory. In the Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie, when Brian describes keeping the gun in the vault, he is not only describing a plan, he is describing a memory of feeling, the accumulation of losses and disappointments, and failed attempts that brought him to the place where that kind of planning felt necessary. Memory is the mechanism of that description. The gun exists because of everything he remembers and cannot make peace with. Grief and consequence are what make stakes real. When a comedy show is willing to handle those things, when it is willing to let characters actually feel the weight of things ending and not ending, it earns the moments when it asks the audience to care. Family Guy, at its best, earns those moments more often than its reputation suggests. Section 10. The music, the references, and the architecture of sadness. There is a particular song that plays under one of the most moving sequences Family Guy ever produced. It is not an original composition. It is not a well-known pop song or a Broadway standard. It is Anne Murray's I Just Fall in Love Again, a soft country ballad from 1978 about the helpless experience of loving someone. The show places it under a montage that involves Chris, and the choice of that specific song, gentle, a little sad, unironic, drawn from the exact musical world that a working-class New England father of a certain generation would have absorbed without quite choosing, says more about the emotional register the show is reaching for than any piece of dialogue in the scene could. This is how Family Guy uses music when it is being careful. Not ostentatiously, not with songs that announce their emotional intention, with songs that carry a particular cultural memory, that reach into the audience's relationship to a period of time or a feeling of vulnerability, and that do the emotional work sideways rather than head-on. The show's formal relationship to music begins with Seth MacFarlane's own musical identity, which is more sophisticated than a lot of people who know him primarily from the show would assume. MacFarlane has released multiple albums of big band standards, collaborating with orchestras and leaning into a golden age Hollywood musical sensibility that is completely earnest, completely unself-conscious, and completely at odds with the show's reputation for shock comedy. He sings Frank Sinatra. He sings Dean Martin. He sings the kind of music that belongs in tuxedos and smoke-filled supper clubs. That sensibility is embedded in Family Guy in ways that are easy to miss. The theme song itself, which opens every episode with the family gathering around the piano, is modeled on the opening of All in the Family, where Archie and Edith Bunker sing together at the piano. This is not incidental. All in the Family is the most important show in American television history for dramatizing working-class family dysfunction, and MacFarlane begins every episode of Family Guy by invoking it. He is placing Family Guy in that lineage. He is saying, this is a show about people who love each other in ways that are difficult and complicated and often expressed badly, and there is music in that house. The show's original songs, and it produced a remarkable number of them across its run, divide roughly into two categories. There are the comedy songs, the deliberately shocking pieces that use the musical form to amplify the offensiveness of the content. And then there are the other ones, the ones that sneak up on you. You Have AIDS from Season 4 is staged as a barbershop quartet number performed by men in matching outfits at a hospital patient's bedside. The content is designed to shock, but the musical form, the precisely harmonized, carefully staged barbershop number, is so fully realized that the shock is only part of what you feel. The other part is something harder to name. The musical form itself is nostalgic and warm and associated with communal comfort. And the show has placed that form in the most uncomfortable possible context. The dissonance between form and content is the joke, but the form is real, and it carries its own emotional history into the scene whether you want it there or not. Down Syndrome Girl from Season 8 is another example of this technique. The song is comedically framed, but it is also, musically, a genuinely affectionate piece. The sentiment underneath the comedy is real. Meg befriends a young man with Down syndrome, and their friendship, expressed through a musical number, is treated with a warmth that coexists with the comedy rather than being undermined by it. The music does not wink at the audience. It commits. The road trip episodes produce some of the show's most accomplished musical moments. In Road to Europe, Brian and Stewie end up at a live performance by Kiss, and then at what turns out to be the BBC, and the episode's willingness to stage elaborate musical sequences is matched by the writing's willingness to use those sequences for character-driven purpose. The songs Brian and Stewie perform together in these episodes are not just comedy numbers. They are expressions of a friendship that has its own vocabulary, its own private references, its own emotional shorthand. The show's use of classical music, and it uses classical music with much more frequency than the average comedy audience would notice, follows the same pattern as its use of popular music. The references are specific, chosen rather than random, and often tell you something about the character whose scene they accompany. When Lois teaches piano and a student plays incorrectly, Stewie's correction, calling the student Salieri after Mozart's rival, is a joke built on the assumption that the audience either knows or will look up who Antonio Salieri was and why being called that name. In that context is an insult. This is a high-reference comedy moment embedded in what is ostensibly a low-reference comedy show. The show does this constantly. It is confident that the jokes will land for the audience members who have the reference and will read as playfully mysterious to the ones who do not. Stewie's relationship to music is one of the character's defining qualities, and it is handled consistently across seasons and in ways that other aspects of his character are not. He responds to music with a directness that he rarely brings to other stimuli. He has opinions about it. He performs it with commitment. He uses it as a language for feelings that his verbal language cannot adequately express. In the episode where Stewie briefly befriends a girl named Olivia and they stage a theatrical production together, the musical sequences they share are the only time in that episode when Stewie is fully, unguardedly present. The architecture of sadness in Family Guy is not built in the obvious places. It is not in the episodes where characters deliver speeches about how hard life is. It is in the songs that play under montages of things ending. It is in the instruments that score scenes that are nominally comic, but that the orchestra treats with the gravity of something that matters. It is in the choice of which piece of music to place under which moment, made by Walter Murphy and his team in collaboration with the show's writers and directors. Choices that accumulate across hundreds of episodes into something that resembles a consistent emotional argument about what it feels like to be a person in a family that loves you imperfectly. The show argues through its music that ordinary life is full of beauty that the people living it rarely have time to register. That the moments of genuine feeling arrive without announcement, often inside of joke-shaped packages, and that the music is the mechanism by which those moments are identified as the real ones. The ones that will stay with you after the punchline is forgotten. Section 11. Seth MacFarlane's Fingerprints. Every television show is an act of self-expression by the people who make it, but some shows are more clearly expressions of a single person's vision than others. And Family Guy is one of the most personal major network series ever produced. The fingerprints of Seth MacFarlane are everywhere in the show, in ways that go beyond the obvious fact of him voicing four major characters. His sensibility, his aesthetic values, his political commitments, his aesthetic loyalties, his specific kind of melancholy, shaped the show at every level, and the show changed when he stepped back from active involvement in its writing and direction. MacFarlane was born in 1973, which means he grew up in the specific overlap between the end of classic Hollywood glamour and the beginning of the ironic detachment of 1980s and 1990s popular culture. He has one foot in a world that believed in emotional directness and formal craft, the world of Frank Sinatra and Gene Kelly and the MGM musical, and one foot in a world defined by distance and irony and the postmodern sense that sincerity is embarrassing. Family Guy lives at the intersection of those two worlds, and that is why it behaves the way it does. The sincerity and the detachment are both real. The show is not using irony to undercut the genuine emotion. The show is using irony as a delivery mechanism for genuine emotion, because that is what the cultural moment it emerged from required. MacFarlane's political views are embedded in the show with a consistency that goes beyond Brian's liberal soapboxing, which is the most obvious manifestation. The show's consistent sympathy for working-class people, its skepticism about institutional authority, its discomfort with wealth and privilege as values, its willingness to ask uncomfortable questions about religion. All of these are MacFarlane's views, expressed through the show's narrative choices over years of episodes. Peter Griffin works at a brewery. He has no post-secondary education. He lives in a modest house in a modest street and worries about money with a consistency that the show's comedy does not entirely obscure. His world is the world of the working class, and the show's treatment of that world is not condescending. It is not the treatment of a wealthy showrunner looking down at a type. It is the treatment of a storyteller who understands the texture of that life, the specific pride, the specific shame, the specific ways in which people who live that life are required to perform a kind of toughness that covers more complicated territory. MacFarlane's relationship to religion is expressed through the show's formal treatment of faith more than through any single speech or plotline. Family Guy takes religion seriously enough to critique it specifically. It does not dismiss it as irrelevant. It has episodes that engage with the Catholic Church, with Protestant evangelical culture, with questions of faith and doubt, and the psychological function of belief. These episodes are sometimes offensive and sometimes profound, but they are never incurious. MacFarlane is interested in why people believe things, and that interest makes the show's treatments of religion more nuanced than critics who focus on the most provocative moments acknowledge. The show's treatment of mortality, which we explored in the previous section, is deeply personal in ways that are hard to verify but easy to feel. MacFarlane has spoken in interviews about his own near miss with the September 11th attacks. He was supposed to be on one of the hijacked flights and missed it by chance. This experience is not something he discusses at length, but its shadow falls across the show's relationship to sudden death, random catastrophe, and the question of what we do with our time before things end. The randomness of death in Family Guy, the way characters die in the middle of sentences without build-up, without the dignity of a dramatic ending, is partly a comedy choice. But it is also a formal argument about the nature of loss. Things end abruptly. The world does not arrange itself for narrative closure. The truck does not wait for you to finish your sentence. This is a show that knows this in a way that feels personal rather than theoretical. MacFarlane's love of theatrical performance, of Broadway, of jazz, of the kind of skilled vocalism associated with Sinatra-era popular music, gives the show its distinctive relationship to music, which we discussed in the previous section. But it also shapes the show's formal sense of what performance is. The characters in Family Guy are always, on some level, performing for each other. The masks they wear, the personas they inhabit, the ways they manage other people's expectations. The show treats all of this as a kind of performance that is simultaneously protective and imprisoning. Brian Griffin is the character most clearly shaped by MacFarlane's own self-conception. Brian is the intellectual with literary pretensions who cannot quite bridge the gap between who he wants to be and who he is. He is the man of sophisticated aesthetic tastes who lives among people who do not share them and who therefore occupies an uncomfortable in-between space. Too intelligent to be entirely comfortable in Peter's world, not accomplished enough to be comfortable in the world his tastes aspire toward. This is a recognizable position. It is a position MacFarlane has described occupying at various points in his career. The person who grew up with big band music and classical film references in a cultural environment that had moved on from those things. The show's willingness to let its characters be wrong, to let Peter be wrong, to let Brian be wrong, to let Quagmire be wrong about things that matter, is another MacFarlane fingerprint. There is no consistent moral compass in the show, no single character who always has the right answer, no narrative voice that adjudicates between the characters' competing worldviews. This is an authorial choice. It reflects a creator who distrusts simple moral clarity, who understands that people are contradictory, and who believes that comedy is at its best when it holds contradictions rather than resolving them. The show's most MacFarlane-specific moment might be the opening of every episode. The family at the piano, playing together, the theme song playing, the image of warmth and domesticity before the chaos begins. He chose this. He chose to open his show every time with the image of a family making music together. Not fighting, not failing. Making music together. That image is the aspiration. Everything that follows is the distance between the aspiration and the reality. And MacFarlane has been honest enough, across years of episodes, to let the distance be real without letting it make the aspiration seem foolish. Section 12. The show that knew what it was. The most interesting formal development in Family Guy across its long run is the show's gradual acquisition of self-awareness, and the way that self-awareness was handled. Sometimes brilliantly, sometimes as pure avoidance, but always revealing. Tells you something essential about what kind of show it always understood itself to be. Family Guy became self-referential early. The first season already contains moments where the show winks at its own conventions, moments where the audience's awareness of the comedy format is part of the joke. But the self-awareness deepened significantly after the show's revival in 2005, and by the later seasons it had become something more pervasive. The show talking to itself, about itself, through its characters, in ways that are occasionally uncomfortable to watch because they seem to be confessing things rather than just joking. The fourth wall breaks in Family Guy are not just meta-humor. They are a character behavior. They happen most often with Peter, who addresses the audience directly in moments of frustration or confusion. And the quality of what Peter says in these moments is different from the quality of what he says when he thinks no one outside the show's world is watching. He is more honest when he breaks the fourth wall, more direct, less defended. When Peter looks at the camera and says something self-deprecating about the show, about the quality of a joke, about the repetitiveness of a premise, about the length of a running bit, he is performing the show's awareness of its own limits. And the audience responds to this with something that is not quite forgiveness but resembles it. Knowing you are not at your best is a form of integrity. The show extends itself credit for this knowing. The episode Back to the Pilot from Season 10 sends Brian and Stewie back to the first episode of Family Guy through the time machine, and the episode uses this premise to place the show in direct conversation with its own history. The characters from the present observe the characters from the past and notice the differences. The humor in this episode comes from the specificity of what has changed, the animation, the character voices, the comedic rhythms. But the emotional weight of the episode comes from the show's willingness to acknowledge that change happened, and that not all of it was progress. Brian, watching his past self, is watching a version of himself that had things he has since lost. He was more genuinely intellectual then, more carefully in relationship with his own values, less contradicted by his behavior. The episode does not dwell on this. It returns to the comedy quickly. But the moment of recognition is real. The past version of Brian is better than the present version. The show knows this. The episode Cutaway Land, which built an entire episode around the premise of Peter and Lois literally traveling into the show's own cutaway sequences, is the most ambitious and least successful of the show's formal self-investigations. It recycled older cutaways rather than creating new ones, which undercut the premise. And it ended with the dream sequence reveal, the oldest and most exhausted storytelling device available, which suggested the writers had a concept without a conclusion. But even in failure, the episode reveals something. The show was interested in understanding its own formal choices. It wanted to think about what the cutaway meant, what the space of the cutaway sequence was, what it meant for characters to inhabit the supposedly disconnected jokes. The ambition was genuine. The execution fell short. But you cannot fake that kind of formal curiosity. The show's relationship to its own Emmy nomination history is another thread of self-awareness worth noting. In 2009, Family Guy became the first animated series to receive a Primetime Emmy nomination for Outstanding Comedy Series since The Flintstones in 1961, a gap of nearly 50 years. The nomination was remarkable and was treated with genuine excitement within the show's production. It was formal recognition that the show was doing something that deserved to be taken seriously. The show has referenced this nomination and its failure to win multiple times in subsequent episodes. And the references are funny, but they are also something else. They are the show registering a real disappointment. The formal recognition it received was extraordinary and unprecedented, and it did not translate into the kind of sustained critical reconsideration that the nomination implied. Critics acknowledged the nomination and then largely returned to treating the show as below serious analysis. This is the specific frustration that runs underneath Family Guy's most self-aware moments. The show knows it is doing something. The show knows that what it is doing is not simple and not low. And the show has watched that knowledge be mostly unacknowledged by the culture around it. The fourth wall breaks are partly an expression of this. The show reaching over the heads of its characters to speak directly to the audience, hoping to find someone there who is paying the right kind of attention. The show's treatment of its own continuity is a form of self-awareness that operates in a completely different register. Family Guy is famously loose about continuity. Events happen in one episode and are forgotten the next. Characters die and are revived. Knowledge is acquired and then lost. This is partly simple sitcom episodic logic. The format requires a reset each week so that each episode is accessible as a standalone. But in Family Guy, the loose continuity does something else as well. It enacts a formal argument about memory and identity. The characters forget things not just because the writers chose not to track them, but because the show is interested in what it means to be a character who lives in the present without full access to their own past. Peter does not learn. He forgets lessons. Not because he is stupid. We discussed why that reading is incomplete. But because the show treats him as someone whose relationship to his own history is genuinely fractured. He has had experiences that should have changed him. They did not stick. The show presents this not as a failure of character development, but as a characteristic of a certain kind of person. Someone who processes experience through action rather than through reflection, and for whom each day is therefore genuinely new in ways that make cumulative growth very difficult. This is not an endorsement of that way of living. It is an honest portrayal of it. The show's final, most interesting form of self-knowledge is the one it expresses through its own longevity. Family Guy has continued for decades, well past the point when its original creative mandate was exhausted, well past the creative involvement of its founder, well past the moment when most critics would say it should have stopped. And the show knows this. It has made jokes about being on too long. It has had characters acknowledge that they are tired, that the premise is worn, that everything that needed to be said has been said. But it continues. And in continuing, it makes an inadvertent argument that actually lands harder than most of the deliberate ones. The argument is this: families continue even when they are exhausted. People stay in relationships that have changed beyond what they chose. The routines persist because the people inside them persist, because stopping requires a decision that never quite becomes the right one at the right moment. The Griffins keep having adventures not because adventures are still surprising, but because that is what the Griffins do. And the Griffins are who they are, and being who you are means continuing to be it. This is, in the end, the thing that the show was always about. Not the jokes, not the cutaways, not the cultural references, not the controversy. The thing at the center of Family Guy, the thing it was always reaching toward in its best moments and apologizing for abandoning in its worst, is the simple fact of a family that stays. They are not good to each other, not consistently. They do not understand each other, not fully. They repeat patterns that hurt them. They fail to grow. They live in a loop that self-conscious episodes occasionally acknowledge but cannot quite break. But they stay. They go home. Every episode, every adventure, every catastrophe they go home. To the house on Spooner Street, to the dinner table, to the couch, to each other. And in the morning, the sun comes up over Quahog, and the Griffins are still there, still imperfect, still exactly who they are, still somehow managing the impossible daily project of being a family in a world that does not make it easy. That is not a comedy premise. That is a love story. A long, complicated, frequently frustrating, occasionally beautiful love story, told at 22 minutes per episode over more than 2 decades, to more people than could fit in some countries. The show that people watched to fall asleep knew exactly what it was doing. It was telling you something true about the people you love and the compromises you make to keep them close. And it dressed that truth in cartoon characters and chicken fights and cutaway gags about the 1980s, because the truth dressed any other way would have been too much to sit with. Family Guy always knew. It just chose to hide it well enough that you could find it when you were ready. If you made it this far, genuinely, thank you. This kind of video takes a long time to put together, and it means everything that you were here for all of it. If something in here landed for you, leave a comment and tell us which character you see differently now, or which detail you are going back to rewatch. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is a good time. There are more of these coming, going just as deep into the shows and worlds that look simple on the surface and turn out to have a lot more underneath. See you in the next one. Section 2. Expanded. Peter Griffin's Secret Competence, continued. There is a scene in the Season 2 episode Da Boom, where the world has apparently ended and the Griffins are trying to survive the apocalypse. The comedy of the episode is broad and fast. There are jokes about radiation, about the absurdity of doomsday prepping, about the specific ways Peter is incapable of leading anything. But in the middle of all of this, there is a moment where Peter looks at his family, really looks at them, the way a person looks when they are absorbing the fact that the people they love are still present and still alive, and the show holds that look for longer than a comedy beat requires. Peter Griffin loves his family. This is the bedrock, not the surface. The surface is chaos and cruelty and a staggering indifference to consequences. But the bedrock, the thing the show was built on, and the thing that makes the surface bearable to watch, is that this man loves these people in a way that is real even when it is poorly expressed, that is genuine even when it is completely inarticulate, that is constant even when it is invisible under layers of behavior that look like its opposite. Understanding Peter requires understanding the specific tradition of American working-class masculinity that shaped him. He is not drawn from nowhere. He comes from a very specific place, the post-World War II, Catholic, northeastern working-class world in which men were expected to provide and protect, and not much else in the way of emotional labor. In that world, saying, "I love you" was something women did. Men showed up, they worked, they stayed. And if you were paying attention, the staying was the love. The showing up was the love. You were not supposed to need the words because the presence was supposed to be enough. Peter cannot make that translation work in the modern context he inhabits. He is a man of that older emotional vocabulary trying to communicate in a world that has developed a more explicit set of requirements for intimacy. He fails at this regularly. He fails with Lois, who needs him to be present in ways that go beyond physically being in the house. He fails with Meg, who needs him to see her as a person rather than a role. He fails with Chris, though less completely, because Chris has not yet developed the language to articulate what he needs, and so Peter can meet him at the level of physical presence without the gap being as apparent. But the failure is not absence of feeling. It is the failure of translation. And there is a difference. The drunken clam is where Peter is most himself, and it is worth looking closely at what that means. The bar is his element, not because he is a drinker, though he is, but because the bar is a space with a specific social contract. Everyone at the bar knows the contract. You do not reach past the comedy into the vulnerability. You talk about sports and work and the absurd things that happened this week. You do not make direct emotional demands. You accept the person across from you at the level they present themselves, because that is the contract. Peter thrives in spaces with clear contracts. He is uncomfortable in spaces where the rules are ambiguous, where the required response is not legible from the situation, where emotional attunement is the needed tool, and emotional attunement is the tool he has the least access to. This is not stupidity. This is a very specific kind of social disability that the show often plays as stupidity because it is funnier that way, but that the character's better moments reveal as something more complicated. The episode The Sun also draws from Season 1, sends Peter and Chris on a vision quest after Chris is expelled from the Scouts. The episode is comedic throughout, but it contains a father-son dynamic that is specific and true. Peter and Chris are both people who struggle to communicate in the register that the world around them expects. They are both more comfortable doing things together than talking about doing things. The episode's resolution, the two of them finding each other in the wilderness in a shared experience rather than a shared conversation, is the show honoring the fact that for some people, presence is the vocabulary. They do not need the words. They need the person standing there. Peter's relationship to failure is one of the most precisely observed aspects of the character. He fails constantly at everything in ways that are frequently catastrophic. But he does not respond to failure the way someone who is genuinely stupid responds to it, with incomprehension or denial or an inability to register that anything went wrong. Peter responds to his failures with what looks like indifference, but is actually a very fast burial. He puts the failure underground and moves on. He does not process it, does not integrate it, does not allow it to become the foundation for changed behavior. The failure goes in the ground, and he builds the next attempt on top of it. This is, if you follow it long enough, exhausting and sad. A man who cannot fail his way to learning is a man doomed to repeat his failures indefinitely. And the show, over its run, is honest about this. Peter does not become better. He cycles. The same mistakes reappear in new contexts with new wrapping, but the same interior structure. He loves and he fails, and he buries the failure, and he loves again with no more equipment than he had the time before. If the show ended with a lesson, that lesson would be somewhere in this cycle. But the show is not interested in lessons. It is interested in accurate portraits. And the accurate portrait of Peter Griffin is a man perpetually in motion, perpetually failing, perpetually buried in his own history, perpetually reaching towards something he has not yet developed the language to name, but that anyone watching can see plainly. He wants to be good enough. He wants the people he loves to believe he is capable of being what they need. He is terrified that they are right not to believe it, and the terror expresses itself as bluster and avoidance and the specific cruelty of someone who cannot allow themselves to be seen failing, so they destroy the situation before they can fail in front of it. There is a theory in psychology called terror management theory, which argues that much of human behavior can be understood as management of the anxiety produced by the awareness of mortality. People construct identities, beliefs, systems of meaning, elaborate architecture, in order to manage the terror of knowing that they will die. When that architecture is threatened, people respond with aggression, with rigidity, with the urgent need to assert the thing that is being threatened. This is too grand a frame for a network animated comedy, but there is something in the neighborhood of this that applies to Peter Griffin. Not mortality specifically, but the awareness of inadequacy. Peter manages the terror of his own inadequacy by never fully stopping long enough to register it. The motion is the management. The chaos is the distraction. If he keeps moving, the thing he is running from cannot catch up with him and make him sit still long enough to understand it. The moments when he does sit still, the rare, brief, early season moments when Peter is quiet and present and looking at something with his full attention, are the moments when you see what is underneath all the noise. A man who knows he is not quite enough and who loves the people around him more than he knows how to say. Section 3. Expanded. Brian Griffin's tragedy continued. Brian Griffin is the show's portrait of what intelligence costs when it is not matched by the courage to use it. He is smarter than Peter, smarter than most of the people around him, and he knows it. But intelligence that is not directed toward anything, that is not channeled into work, into relationships, into genuine engagement with the world, becomes a kind of liability. It means you see clearly what you are not doing. It means you understand your own failures with a precision that is not available to people who are less aware. Brian's intelligence does not protect him from his dysfunction. It amplifies it. He can see exactly where he's going wrong and exactly why, and the seeing is almost the whole story, because what follows the seeing is usually inaction. The unfinished novel is the center of this problem. We talked about it in terms of protection, keeping the novel unfinished as a way of keeping the identity of serious writer without having to test that identity against the world's response. But there is more to it than protection. There is also the specific paralysis of the person who has read enough good writing to know that what they are producing is not yet good. Brian has good taste. He knows what excellence looks like. And the gap between his taste and his current capacity is a gap he does not know how to close, because closing it would require the sustained effort of continuing to produce work that does not yet meet his standards, and the humiliation of that sustained inadequacy is more than he can bear. This is the creative person's most common and most debilitating problem. T.S. Eliot described it as the gap between the ideal and the actual. Ira Glass described it as a taste and the ability being out of sync, and the solution being simply to produce a large volume of work until the ability catches up to the taste. Brian knows the theory. He has read the books that contain the theory. But knowing the theory and living through the application of it are different things, and Brian is the character the show builds to honor the difficulty of that difference. His alcoholism, soft-pedaled in the early seasons, more prominent later, is another piece of this picture. Drinking is the classic management strategy of the person with high intelligence and low tolerance for the discomfort of not being at their best. You cannot be inadequate while you are drinking, because drinking provides a ready explanation for the inadequacy. The novel is not finished? Well, I have been drinking. The relationship failed? Well, I have been drinking. It is a self-defeating loop, of course. The drinking is also a cause of the inadequacy it supposedly explains. But loops of this kind are precisely the loops that intelligent people fall into, because the intelligence constructs the justification faster than the self-awareness can dismantle it. The scene in Brian and Stewie where Brian reveals the contents of the safety deposit box, the gun, the scotch, is the scene where all of this comes together in the most honest way the show ever managed. He is not in a crisis moment when this is revealed. He is not on the edge of anything. He just has those things there. Waiting as options. The scotch is for his last drink. The gun is for what comes after. What makes this scene so quietly devastating is that it is not dramatic. Brian does not break down when he talks about it. He explains it with the same analytical detachment he brings to most of his self-descriptions. And the detachment is itself the proof of how serious it is. He has thought about this enough to have moved past the emotional charge of the thought. He has made a plan with the same intelligence he applies to everything else. The plan is organized, prepared, ready. Stewie's response to this revelation is one of the most carefully performed moments in Seth MacFarlane's voicing of either character. Stewie, who is chronically unable to admit vulnerability or need, who has spent the entire episode being aggressive and demanding and difficult, goes quiet. And then he says, in a voice that has entirely dropped the theatrical British villain register, that Brian is his only friend. That Brian gives his life purpose. That he needs Brian to not do the thing Brian is keeping that box for. The show does not give Brian a cure at the end of this episode. He does not renounce the box. He does not make a speech about reasons to live. He just reads to Stewie, who falls asleep, and in the morning, the vault opens and they walk out. The episode ends not with a resolution, but with a continuance. Brian is still who he is. The box is probably still there. But Stewie was there, and Stewie said the true thing, and for now, that is enough to walk out of the vault and back into the day. This is how the show treats mental health at its most honest. Not with solutions, with presence, with the small, persistent, unceremonious fact of someone choosing to stay. The friendship between Brian and Quagmire, the adversarial relationship that produced Quagmire's famous speech about why he cannot stand Brian, is, at its bottom, a story about recognition. Quagmire hates Brian partly because he recognizes something in Brian that he sees as a particularly insidious kind of dishonesty. Quagmire himself is dishonest in ways he is completely transparent about. He is a predator with his sexuality, and he knows it and does not pretend otherwise. But Brian is dishonest in a way that Quagmire finds more galling. He presents himself as a moral superior while behaving in ways that are morally equivalent to, or worse than, Quagmire's own behavior. The specific thing Quagmire names in his speech, Brian's persistent attraction to Lois, displayed right in front of Peter, treated as an acceptable joke, is actually a real observation about Brian's character. Brian's love for Lois, which in the early seasons was handled with such dignity, became in the later seasons something more troubling. A fixture of his personality that he uses rather than acknowledges, that gives him a role in the Griffin household without requiring him to do anything with it. He is in love with a married woman who is his best friend's wife. He has been in love with her for years. He does nothing about it, which in the early seasons was about dignity and in the later seasons is about avoidance. The feeling functions as an alibi. As long as he is carrying this impossible love, he cannot fully invest in other relationships. The impossible love gives him a reason for his relational failures that locates the problem outside himself. Quagmire sees this. He names it. And the show, to its credit, makes Quagmire's speech completely accurate. Everything he says is backed up by what the show has actually depicted, while also making it clear that Quagmire is not a reliable moral authority. He is right about Brian. He is also Glenn Quagmire. The truth can come from compromised sources. That is actually one of the show's more sophisticated insights. Section 4. Expanded. Stewie's Inner World, continued. The question of what Stewie Griffin is actually feeling, underneath everything the show presents on the surface, is one that the character himself seems genuinely interested in. He spends more time than almost any other character on the show engaged in forms of self-examination, not always the productive kind, and often expressed through elaborate performative schemes rather than direct introspection, but nonetheless consistently turned toward himself and his own experience. This is unusual for an animated character, and particularly unusual for an animated character in a comedy. Animated comedies generally resist self-examination in their characters because self-examination slows things down. It requires quiet. It requires the audience to sit with a character's uncertainty rather than their certainty, and uncertainty is harder to be funny about than confidence. But Stewie is a character who is genuinely uncertain about himself in ways the show honors. The world domination persona, the British accent, the elaborate weapons, the villainous monologuing, is a persona. It is constructed. And the show, from relatively early on, allowed cracks in the construction to show little moments where the persona slipped and something else appeared briefly before the performance resumed. The most revealing category of these cracks involves Stewie's relationship to loneliness. He is objectively one of the most isolated characters in the show. He lives in a nursery, he cannot drive, he cannot walk freely in the world. Most of the adults around him either do not hear him or respond to his extraordinary intelligence with the kind of bored normalization that parents apply to children who are demonstrably more capable than the parenting situation expects. Lois treats Stewie like a baby because he is a baby, which is technically accurate and experientially maddening. His loneliness is not something he complains about directly. Complaint would require an acknowledgement of need, and need is the one thing Stewie's persona most strenuously denies. But the loneliness emerges through the elaborate nature of his schemes, the scale of his plans, the way he needs audiences even for his private moments. He narrates his own plots. He explains his own evil schemes out loud in an empty room. He is performing for someone, even when no one is there, because the performance is the only framework he has for the interior life he cannot otherwise express. The Rupert relationship, which we touched on earlier, deepens across the seasons in ways that go beyond the comedy premise. Stewie begins to use Rupert not just as a toy, but as a confidant, a genuine listener for the things he cannot say to Brian or to anyone else. The conversations he has with Rupert are the conversations he would have with himself if he could tolerate the directness of pure self-conversation. Rupert is the externalized inner voice, the part of Stewie that knows the things Stewie is not ready to admit to knowing. When Brian, in a terrible moment in a later season, destroys Rupert, chews the bear apart while drunk, Stewie's response is not the comedy devastation of a baby losing a toy. It is the response of someone who has had their last safe repository for their interior life violated. The grief is specific. It is about the specific thing that was in Rupert, not just the object. The episode Stewie Loves Lois, which opened season 5 and which many fans consider one of the best post-revival episodes the show produced, makes explicit a subtext that had been running under the surface of the show since its earliest episodes. Stewie needs Lois. Not in spite of wanting to kill her, not as a contradiction of that desire, but in a way that is completely consistent with it, because the object of his most violent fantasies is also the person who holds his world together. The ambivalence is not hypocrisy. It is the oldest and most specifically human of emotional experiences. The episode gives Stewie a period of genuine warmth with Lois. She saves him from choking. He falls into a grateful, affectionate closeness with her, before the return of the dark comedy status quo, and the warmth is handled with such specificity that it reads as true. Not as an ironic version of warmth, not as a setup for a punchline, as a real emotional state, a child experiencing the love of a parent without the armor that usually makes it safe to receive. When the episode returns to the adversarial dynamic, it does so with a formal acknowledgement that the warmth was real. The villain persona resumes, but the episode has already established that the persona is a choice, and that underneath it there is a child who, when given safe access to love, takes it gratefully. The season 6 two-parter, Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie, is the closest the show came to a genuine reckoning with what the Stewie character was actually about. In the first episode, Stewie achieves his stated goal. He kills Lois. And in the aftermath, rather than the triumph the schemes always promised, what follows is a kind of joyless executive function. He takes over the world. He runs it. He makes the announcements and institutes the systems and does all the things that world domination was supposed to feel like. And it does not feel like anything in particular. This is a sophisticated piece of character writing, whether or not it was entirely intentional. The goalpost was supposed to deliver happiness and meaning. The goalpost was reached. The happiness and meaning did not materialize. And the question the episode implicitly asks, what do you do when you get what you were sure you wanted, and it turns out not to be the thing? Is a genuinely interesting question, posed through an animation sequence in which a baby runs a fascist government. The second episode reverses the plot through the simulation twist, which is formally convenient, but also emotionally honest in a way that the show did not fully exploit. The whole thing was a simulation. The world domination was a fantasy. And in the fantasy, Stewie discovered what the fantasy was actually for. Not conquest, but proof. Proof that he was capable of something. Proof that he existed at a scale commensurate with how large he felt on the inside. The world domination was never about the world. It was about the feeling of being seen in full. What follows the two-parter, as the evil genius persona gradually fades and Stewie becomes something more emotionally accessible, is a character no longer protected by the performance. The new Stewie is more vulnerable, more obviously needy, more clearly in search of the thing all children are in search of. A world that will accommodate the size of who you actually are. Section 5. Expanded. Meg Griffin's hidden narrative continued. The question of what Meg Griffin is actually doing in her own story, as opposed to what she is doing in everyone else's story, is one that the show poses consistently and answers inconsistently, and the inconsistency is itself part of the portrait. She is a writer. This is established early and quietly, in a detail that the show does not dramatize but does consistently maintain. Meg writes. She keeps journals. She has aesthetic sensibilities that her family has no framework for recognizing. She is, in the tradition of writers, processing her life through the act of writing it down, which means she is the character most aware of what is actually happening in the Griffin household. She is the family historian. She is the one with the record. This gives Meg a specific kind of power that the show almost never acknowledges directly. The person who writes things down is the person who gets to say what they meant. The person who keeps the record is the person whose version of events persists. Meg is the character everyone ignores, and she is the character who is writing everything down, and the implication, never quite stated, always present, is that Meg Griffin's version of this family's story is the honest one. The show also gives Meg specific talents that emerge occasionally and then disappear back beneath the surface of her designated role as the family's target. She is a skilled driver. She is physically capable in ways that occasionally surprise the other characters and are immediately forgotten. In some episodes, she is shown to be athletically talented. In others, she demonstrates an intellectual capacity that places her clearly above most of her classmates and several of her family members. Each of these abilities appears in an episode and is not integrated into Meg's ongoing characterization, because the show's default position is to return her to the status of the person who has nothing going for her. The talent appears, is used, and is put away. This is not accidental. The show is depicting, in formal terms, the specific experience of a person whose abilities are real, but whose environment consistently fails to recognize, celebrate, or build on them. The talents are there. The audience sees them. The family does not see them. And then they are gone again. This is the most honest thing the show does with Meg. Not the abuse sequences, which are vivid and uncomfortable, but ultimately cartoon-level representations of neglect. The most honest thing is the pattern of talent appearing and disappearing, because that pattern is the show depicting what actually happens to people who grow up without adequate recognition and support. They have the gifts. The gifts go underground. Eventually, the gifts come up less frequently, because the cost of having them recognized as unworthy is higher than the cost of not expressing them at all. Meg's relationship with her peers at James Woods Regional High School is a map of what happens when a person with Meg's particular history tries to form connections outside the family. She reaches too hard. She offers too much too quickly. She is willing to accept terms that are bad for her because she has been trained to accept bad terms. She is easily manipulated by people who understand her need for recognition. Connie D'Amico, the show's recurring popular girl antagonist for Meg, is not just a bully. She is a character who understands exactly what Meg needs and uses that understanding to wield power over her. The most unsettling dynamic in Meg's school storylines is not the cruelty itself, but Meg's response to the cruelty. She keeps going back. She keeps trying with Connie. She keeps showing up in the social spaces where she is not welcome. This is not stupidity. This is the behavior of someone who has been taught that persistence in the face of rejection is the required approach to love. because the love in her primary family required exactly that kind of persistence. She was trained to keep showing up even when the people she was showing up for were not treating her well because that was the only love available, and it was better than the alternative. The season 14 episode Peter's Sister, which attempted to explain Peter's cruelty to Meg through the cycle of abuse Peter was bullied by his sister, who hurt him the way he now hurts Meg, is the show at its most explicitly psychological. And the explanation is not wrong. Cycles of abuse do work this way. People who are hurt frequently reproduce the hurt in their primary relationships because the hurt is the familiar emotional template. It is the shape love came in. And when you are building a family, you work from the shapes you know. What the episode does with this explanation, and what makes it one of the better Meg episodes in the later seasons, is not accept the explanation as exoneration. Peter understanding where his behavior comes from is not the same as Peter being forgiven for it. The episode allows Meg to have both things: the compassion for her father that comes from understanding his history, and the continued reality of what his behavior has cost her. These are not contradictions. They are how complex relationships actually function. The reconciliation at the end of the episode is real, and the fact that it does not stick, that the following episodes return to the default dynamic, is the show's most honest formal gesture about how change works in families. Understanding why something happens does not automatically stop it from happening. Insight and transformation are different things, and the gap between them is where most families live most of the time. Mila Kunis voiced Meg from the second season onward, and her performance over the decades of the show's run is one of animation's quiet achievements. She found in Meg a register that is simultaneously comic and genuinely sad, a voice that performs the comedy of Meg's situation while conveying the actual experience of living it. There are moments in Kunis's performance where something breaks through the comedy framing, a catch in the voice, a note of real fatigue, a moment where the delivery is completely without irony, and those moments are the moments that last. Meg Griffin deserved better, from her family and from her show. But the portrait of her that emerged across the show's run, taken as a whole rather than in isolated moments, is one of the most sustained meditations on the experience of being unseen in a world that is not designed around your visibility. She is the character who makes the show's claim status as a comedy most difficult to sustain. Because Meg's story is not a comedy, it is a Bildungsroman that has not been allowed to reach its conclusion. A coming-of-age story where the age keeps coming, and the coming never resolves into the thing. A coming-of-age story is supposed to resolve into. She is still waiting to be seen. The show knows this. The audience knows this. And the show's final refusal to fully honor that knowledge, its persistent return to the comedy of her suffering rather than the dignity of her endurance, is the one thing about Family Guy that is genuinely hard to defend. Section 6, expanded. The Lois problem. Continued. Lois Pewterschmidt Griffin is a woman who chose a life that was smaller than what she was raised to expect, and the show has spent more than 2 decades asking whether she regrets that choice. The answer it keeps giving is not entirely, and that not entirely is where the character lives. Her wealth of origin is a consistent source of dramatic tension in the show. The Pewterschmidt estate, the sprawling, immaculate, old money property that appears in episodes involving Carter and Barbara, is a physical representation of the life Lois walked away from. When the show returns to that setting, Lois is always slightly different inside it. More guarded, more careful, more aware of how she is being observed and evaluated. Because in her parents' world, she is still being evaluated against the version of her life that she was supposed to have. And the version she chose is perpetually found lacking by that standard. Carter Pewterschmidt, voiced by Seth MacFarlane with a specific waspish authority that is both comic and specific, loves his daughter in the only way he knows how, through the management of her conditions. He wants her to be comfortable. He wants her to be secure. He measures these things in dollars and in social standing, which are the measures his world provided him. The fact that Lois's happiness is not measurable in those terms is a situation Carter spends most of his appearances either trying to remedy, by giving the Griffins money, which never solves the right problems, or simply not registering, because registering it would require him to acknowledge that his daughter's needs cannot be met by the tools he has. This is the texture of Lois's relationship to her father. A constant, gentle disappointment on both sides, maintained with enough affection and enough history that it never quite tips into genuine rupture. They love each other. They cannot reach each other. The wealth is both the means of his love and the barrier to its expression. Lois's relationship to her own wealth, the inherited privilege she walked away from but did not fully leave, Shimada, shows up in the show in small, consistent ways. She knows how to navigate formal settings with an ease Peter does not have. She understands social hierarchies that Peter cannot read. She cooks elaborate meals and keeps the house in a way that is more Martha Stewart than practical necessity. These are the behaviors of a woman who is raised in a specific social class and who carries its habits even when she has chosen to live outside its context. The show never fully commits to investigating what Lois gave up. It gestures toward it. In the modeling episode, in the musical episodes, in the episodes involving her pre-Peter life, but it consistently retreats from the full examination. This is probably because a complete investigation of what Lois sacrificed would require the show to take a position on whether the sacrifice was worth it, and the show genuinely does not know the answer to that question. Lois's relationship to Meg, which we touched on in Meg's section, is the most revealing piece of her characterization in the later seasons. Lois is not an absent mother. She is present. She shows up. She engages. But the quality of her engagement with Meg is different from her engagement with the other children, and the difference is specific. With Chris, Lois is warm and occasionally exasperated. With Stewie, she is affectionate and oblivious to the actual content of his inner life. With Meg, she is careful, slightly distant, more apt to correct than to celebrate. Lois was not always seen as remarkable by her own parents. Carter valued her, but his measurements were external. Barbara survived her marriage by not looking too closely at things. The parenting Lois received was adequate in the ways that can be measured and deficient in the ways that cannot. And so the parenting she offers Meg carries a specific replication of that deficit. Not from cruelty, not from indifference, but from the simple fact that you can only give to your children what you yourself received, unless you have done the specific work of identifying what was missing and committing to doing differently. Lois has not done that work, or has only done parts of it. She is aware in the way that self-aware people are always at least partially aware of their deficits, that she is not fully seeing Meg. The awareness does not translate into action because the action would require a kind of sustained attention to the past that Lois cannot maintain alongside everything else the present requires. Alex Borstein has been unambiguous in interviews that she loves the character of Lois and invests in her with genuine care. The performance across the show's long run carries that investment. You can hear in Borstein's delivery of lines that might otherwise be flat or functional a quality of interiority. The sense of a woman managing more than the dialogue acknowledges. This is the contribution of a great voice actor, filling the space between what the character says and what the character is. Section 7. Expanded. Quagmire, Cleveland, and Joe continued. Glenn Quagmire has a birthday that places him, per the show's mythology, at somewhere in his mid to late 40s when the show is set in the early 2000s. This means he is old enough to have come of age in the late 1960s and 1970s, the specific cultural moment of sexual liberation, of the pill, of the slow dismantling of older models of courtship and commitment. Quagmire emerged from a world that was recalibrating its sexual ethics in real time, and the character he became reflects someone who grabbed the freedoms of that recalibration without fully integrating the responsibilities that went with them. His particular form of serial promiscuity, which the show codes as both comedy and character flaw with more consistency than it sometimes gets credit for, is a way of continuing to pursue connection through the only mechanism that has ever produced it reliably for him: physical intimacy. He is not bad at connecting with people. He connects intensely, briefly, repeatedly. The problem is not the connecting. The problem is the not staying, and the not staying is a choice that has never been fully examined. The episode Quagmire's Baby, in which Quagmire discovers he has fathered a child and then puts her up for adoption, is the closest the show comes to a direct examination of what Quagmire's lifestyle choices have cost. He holds his daughter. He makes the choice to give her a better life than he could provide. He walks away. The episode does not make this simple. It allows Quagmire to be genuinely moved by the daughter he is choosing not to raise, and to make the choice anyway, and to carry the weight of the choice in a way that is specific and real. There is a quality in the scenes where Quagmire holds Annalie, voiced by McFarlane's sister Rachel, that is not comedy. The episode does what the best Family Guy episodes do in their most honest moments. It stops trying to be funny and just shows you a person in a situation that requires them to be more than their habitual self, and then shows you whether they can manage it. Quagmire can manage it. He chooses his daughter's well-being over his own preference. That is a form of love. It is not the form love usually gets celebrated in. It is not the romantic version, not the picturesque version, not the version that gets a wedding or a family portrait or a happy ending montage. But it is real. His protectiveness of Brenda, his sister, is the other window into Quagmire's genuine moral character. He kills Jeff, the man who has been abusing her. This is an action the show presents with unusual seriousness for a comedy series, and the episode around it, Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q, was controversial, partly because it took domestic violence seriously enough to depict it without the usual comedy distancing mechanisms. Quagmire's choice to end the threat is extreme. It is not presented as heroic in the clean sense, but it is presented as coming from a place of genuine love, from the decision that the people he cares about are worth protecting even when the protection is costly. These are not the choices of a man whose entire characterization is a vehicle for sex jokes. These are the choices of a man who loves people and who expresses that love badly most of the time, and well when it matters most. Cleveland Brown is the show's portrait of patience as a form of strength, and the show does not always know how to honor that portrait, but it keeps trying. Cleveland's patience, his ability to remain calm, to absorb chaos without it deforming him, to continue to extend good faith to people who have given him reasons to withdraw it, is the character's defining quality, and the show treats it as a virtue even when the comedy requires it to look like passivity. Cleveland's marriage to Loretta ended because Loretta was unfaithful with Quagmire. This is one of the show's more deliberately uncomfortable pieces of backstory, two of the show's most prominent friendships built across a foundation of genuine betrayal. And the show handles the aftermath of this with more honesty than it usually manages for complex relational situations. Cleveland does not stop being friends with Quagmire. This is the choice that defines what the friendship means to him. He could walk away. He has complete justification for it. But he chooses the friendship over the grievance because the friendship is a real thing, and the grievance, while also real, is not more real than the history he has with both of these men. He makes the choice that honors the longest and deepest relationship rather than the most recent and most painful one. This is not weakness. This is a very specific kind of emotional strength that the show does not usually find a way to honor directly. It is too quiet, too internal, too insufficiently dramatic for the comedic register. But that is present in Cleveland's characterization throughout, available to anyone who is looking for it. His relationship with his son, Cleveland Jr., who appears in the spin-off The Cleveland Show before returning to Family Guy, is handled with a warmth that carries the specific feeling of a father who is trying to do better than what was done to him. Junior is an awkward kid, self-conscious, a little isolated. Cleveland is patient with him, not always insightful, not always knowing the right thing to do, but consistently patient. The patience is the love. Joe Swanson's story is ultimately a story about identity under pressure. He is a man whose identity was built on physical capability, on being the person others could rely on, the hero, the person whose body could be put between harm and the people who needed protection. And then his body was damaged in a way that removed access to much of that physical capability. And the question the show asks over and over in different forms across Joe's storylines is, who are you when the thing you built your identity on is no longer available to you? Joe's answer over the show's run is still Joe, still the police officer, still the husband and father, still the man in the group who takes things seriously when they need to be taken seriously. The disability changed the conditions of his life. It did not change who he is because who he is was never really about the legs. It was about the choices he makes about how to engage with the world, and those choices are still his to make. The episode where Joe regains the ability to walk and then chooses to return to the wheelchair is the fullest expression of this. The walking changes him in ways that are not improvements. He becomes more aggressive, more impulsive, less patient, less grounded. The mobility, which everyone around him assumes he must want, turns out to correlate with a version of himself that he is not willing to be. He chooses deliberately to return to the conditions under which he is most himself. This is a profound statement about identity embedded in an episode that surrounds it with comedy. And it is the kind of detail that only registers if you are paying attention to what Joe's character actually represents. Section 8. Expanded. The cutaway as commentary continued. The structural tension between the cutaway and the main plot in Family Guy's best episodes is not a tension between comedy and drama, but a tension between surface and depth. The cutaway is the surface, the quick, immediately available, easily shareable piece of content that the show produces for the viral clip economy. The main plot is the depth, the sustained character work that requires attention and patience and willingness to sit with something longer than 30 seconds. In the show's earliest and best seasons, these two registers were kept in productive tension. The cutaways were funny enough to satisfy the audience that came for the quick hits, and the main plots were honest enough to satisfy the audience that stayed for what was underneath. The same episode could do both things. You could watch it for the clips and leave satisfied, or you could watch it for the characters and leave having felt something. This dual-track quality is part of why Family Guy attracted an audience so much larger and more diverse than most animated comedies manage. The show was accessible at multiple levels simultaneously. A teenager who wanted to watch something irreverent and fast could enjoy it. An adult who was carrying something heavy and needed to feel like their specific kind of difficulty was being seen could also find something in it. The show did not require a specific mode of engagement. It accommodated many. The formal self-awareness the show developed about cutaways, the jokes about the format, the episodes built around the format, the meta-commentary that appeared with increasing frequency in later seasons, represents an interesting shift in this dynamic. The show stopped using irony as a delivery mechanism for sincerity and started using it as a defense mechanism. Joking about the cutaway problem is a way of acknowledging the problem without having to fix it. It is the creative equivalent of a person who is aware of their bad habits making self-deprecating jokes about those habits instead of addressing them. But even the meta-comedy about cutaways contains honest material. The characters who acknowledge that the show has been on too long are making a real observation. The scenes where Peter talks directly to the audience about the declining quality of a premise are performing something true about the situation the show finds itself in. The self-awareness is real, even if it is being used in place of change, rather than as motivation for it. The specific formal vocabulary of the Family Guy cutaway, the setup phrase, "this is worse than the time," or "this reminds me of when," is worth examining more closely. These phrases are framing devices. They place what follows in a relationship to the speaker's personal history. They say, "Whatever I am about to show you, I have a point of comparison that is even more extreme." They invoke memory. They invoke scale. When Peter says this is worse than the time, he is claiming that the current situation is not the worst thing that has ever happened to him. He has a reference point for worse. This is, in its way, a form of resilience. The cutaway that follows is not just a joke. It is a demonstration that Peter Griffin has survived things. Many things. Things that belong in a catalog of reference experiences he carries with him through his life. The cutaway catalog is, in this reading, Peter's autobiography. Every reference he makes is a piece of his personal history, however absurd. The absurdity does not disqualify it. It is still his. It is still the map of a life. Section 9. Expanded. Death, Grief, and Consequences, continued. The show's treatment of mortality extends beyond the deaths of characters and into the show's relationship to aging, which is one of the stranger and less discussed aspects of a series that famously does not allow its characters to age. Family Guy is set in a perpetual present. The children do not grow up. The adults do not grow old. The house does not change. The neighborhood evolves slightly across seasons to accommodate new characters and new cultural references, but the core geography of the show remains stable across decades of episodes. This is standard animated sitcom practice, and usually no one thinks about it too hard. But Family Guy occasionally turns this convention into a source of genuine unease. The episode Family Guy Through the Years, from season 16, stages the show across different historical periods: the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, showing the Griffin family as they might have existed in each era while maintaining their core identities. The episode is comedically rich, playing with period aesthetics and era-specific humor, but it also does something quietly strange. It shows you the Griffin family aging and not aging simultaneously, moving through decades while somehow remaining exactly themselves in each. The Vietnam sequence, in which Quagmire experiences the war, is handled with enough period-specific darkness to stand apart from the episode's comedy. Quagmire hearing Fortunate Son for the 100th time, clearly damaged by what he has experienced, is a brief but specific portrait of a man being changed by history in ways that will mark him permanently. The comedy does not fully neutralize it. The damage registers. The show also handles the death of minor characters differently than the deaths of major ones, and the difference tells you something about the show's moral arithmetic. Minor characters die easily, frequently, and without narrative consequence. Major characters die with enormous ceremony. The deaths of Brian, the near deaths of Peter, the serious injury episodes, and then are recovered or reversed. This is the logic of how we actually feel about mortality. The death of people we do not know is abstract. The death of people we love is unacceptable. The show formalizes this logic in its treatment of character deaths, and in doing so, it is being honest about the way grief actually works. Selectively, hierarchically, in proportion to love rather than in proportion to the objective significance of the loss. The Pearl Burton episode is the exception that proves the rule. Pearl is a minor character. She exists for one episode. The show gives her enough specific detail, her history, her isolation, the specific quality of what she had given up, that her death matters beyond her narrative function. Her death is treated with the weight of a major character death, even though she is technically a minor one, and the reason is simple. Brian loved her by the time she died. The show followed its own logic. The love is what determines the scale of the loss. This is a sophisticated piece of moral reasoning for a show that is primarily known for a man fighting a giant chicken. Section 10. Expanded. The music, the references, and the architecture of sadness continued. The specific musical reference that Family Guy returns to more than any other across its entire run is the American popular song tradition of the 1940s through the 1960s. This is MacFarlane's personal musical home, and its presence in the show is not nostalgia in the dismissive sense, but a genuine argument about value. An argument that the emotional directness of that musical tradition, its willingness to be openly about love and loss and longing without ironic distance, is something worth preserving. The big band standard, which MacFarlane records in his personal musical career with full orchestral arrangements, appears in Family Guy in multiple registers. Sometimes it is parodied. The comedy comes from the incongruity of a full swing arrangement applied to a ridiculous situation. Sometimes it is sincere. The show stages a genuine, unironic performance of the form, usually with Brian and Stewie performing together, that acknowledges the form's emotional power without domesticating it. The episode Road to the North Pole stages a sequence in which Brian and Stewie, cold and tired and carrying more weight than the journey called for, sing a song that is built from the emotional vocabulary of those old standards. The song is funny, yes, but the humor does not fully extinguish what the music is doing. The music is about endurance, about continuing to move forward through something hard, about the small warmth of having someone beside you, even when the cold is winning. The show's relationship to film scoring, the vocabulary of dramatic orchestral underscore that Walter Murphy developed for the series, creates a permanent emotional undertow beneath even the show's most comic content. The strings that play under a joke are real strings. The brass that punctuates a slapstick moment carries the full weight of the tradition it comes from. This is not comic scoring in the way that most animated comedies are scored, with percussive sting sounds and comic takes. It is the scoring of a drama applied to a comedy, and the dissonance between those two things is maintained across every episode, sustaining a dual emotional register even when the writing has abandoned it. This means that even in the show's weakest episodes, even in the moments where the writing has collapsed into something thin and cheap, the music continues to argue that what is happening matters. The orchestra does not take a week off because the script is lazy. The cues still swell at the moments of potential feeling. The scoring continues to insist on depth even when the surface has given it up. This is perhaps the most interesting formal persistence in the whole show. The music outlasted the writing. The emotional architecture of the score survived seasons that did not deserve it. And for viewers who respond to music below the level of conscious processing, which is most viewers most of the time, the score kept the door open to feeling something, even when the jokes and the characters were not doing their part. Section 11. Expanded. Seth MacFarlane's Fingerprints, continued. The Orville McFarlane's science fiction series that premiered in 2017 on Fox before moving to Hulu is the most direct expression of his creative values outside of the animated universe, and it illuminates Family Guy by contrast in interesting ways. The Orville is earnest in the way that Family Guy is afraid to be. It is a show built on the model of classic Star Trek, a show that believes in progress, in the potential of humanity to be better than it has been, in the capacity of diverse people to cooperate toward genuine common good. MacFarlane made it without irony. He made it as a love letter to a tradition that shaped his values, and he made it with complete conviction that those values are worth defending. The emotional core of the Orville, optimism about what people can be when they commit to their best impulses, is also the emotional aspiration of Family Guy's best moments. When Peter and Lois make up, when Brian and Stewie are genuinely good to each other, when Joe refuses to let his injury define him, when Cleveland chooses the friendship over the grievance. These are moments of people committing to their best impulses, and they are the moments the show protects most carefully, the ones it returns to even across seasons that abandoned most of what made the show good. MacFarlane wanted to make something true. He kept trying to make something true across an enormous body of work and across decades of cultural shifts that made sincerity more and more difficult to maintain. Family Guy is the record of that attempt, its successes, its failures, its compromises, and its rare moments of complete honesty. The show was never a product, it was a person. It had the person's inconsistencies and self-deceptions and occasional moments of clarity. And if you watch it the way you would engage with a person, with patience, with willingness to sit through the difficult parts, with attention to the moments when the defense comes down, it reveals something that most critics and most casual viewers were never looking for. A man trying to tell the truth about family, about love, about the strange endurance of domestic life in the only language available to him, which was cartoon noise accompanied by a full orchestra. Section 12. Expanded. The show that knew what it was, continued. The show's self-awareness reaches its most interesting territory in the episodes that do not acknowledge it directly. The episodes where the show is simply being what it is, without commentary on that identity, with complete confidence in the framework it has built. These episodes are scattered through every season, though more densely in the earlier ones. They are the episodes that feel alive rather than performed, the ones where the characters move through situations with the specificity of real people rather than the efficiency of comedic functions. In these episodes, the show does not need to tell you it is doing something. It is just doing it. The Season 3 episode Screwed the Pooch, in which Brian has a romantic relationship with a dog named Seabreeze and navigates the complicated social and emotional territory of animal attraction, in a world where he is both animal and human, is a funnier and stranger and more honest episode about outsider identity than its premise suggests. Brian, in this episode, is the person who does not fit the available categories. He is human enough to desire human things and animal enough to desire animal things, and neither world will accept him fully in both of his registers simultaneously. He is always translating, he is always half-legible. This is the condition of anyone who grew up between worlds, who carries two identities that the world around them insists must be a contradiction. The show wraps it in the premise of a talking dog falling in love with an actual dog, which is comic and also somehow exactly right. The episode I Am Peter, Hear Me Roar from Season 2 sends Peter to a sensitivity seminar after a sexual harassment complaint, and comes out of it with a temporarily transformed Peter, who is more emotionally attuned and more self-aware than usual. The comedy of the episode comes from the dissonance between sensitive Peter and his usual context. But the episode is also asking a real question. Is the sensitive version of Peter an imposter? Or is it a version of him that has always existed and never been given space to emerge? The answer the episode provides is not the one the comedy requires. The sensitivity retreats not because it was fake, but because the environment Peter returns to does not support it. He becomes who his context allows him to be, which is the most honest thing the show can say about why people stay the same. Not because they have no capacity for change, but because change requires an environment that can hold the changed version, and most environments are not that accommodating. The show's awareness of its own position in the culture, of what it is seen as, of what it is compared to, of how it is evaluated by the standards of the television criticism that has never quite decided whether to take it seriously, shows up in specific moments that are funnier if you know the context. The references to The Simpsons, to South Park, to other animated comedies are not just competitive jabs. They are the show locating itself in a tradition and arguing for its place in it. When Family Guy invokes The Simpsons, it is acknowledging the lineage and daring you to dismiss the inheritance. The show won its Emmy nomination in 2009 and lost to 30 Rock. This is, to the show's credit, exactly the kind of outcome the show would have made a joke about. The critically acclaimed, formally sophisticated comedy winning over the one that the audience actually watches in the largest numbers. And in subsequent seasons, there are moments where you can feel the show processing that particular piece of its history. The fourth wall breaks that reference the Emmys are not just jokes about institutional recognition. They are expressions of genuine frustration from a show that understood its own worth and never quite received the acknowledgement it sought. The final thing to say about Family Guy as a show that knew what it was is this. It understood at some level that its longevity was its own argument. By continuing, by persisting, by outlasting the criticism and the declining ratings and the cultural drift that left it behind, the show made a formal case for something it could not make verbally. It kept going. It stayed. The Griffins stayed in that house on Spooner Street. The friends kept meeting at the Drunken Clam. The family kept having dinner, kept fighting, kept making up, kept getting it wrong, kept trying again. Across seasons and decades, the show's most powerful and least articulated argument was simply its own persistence. The refusal to stop. The decision to keep showing up. In this way, the show is the most honest portrait it could produce of its own subject matter. A family. Not a pretty family, not a functional family, not a family that deserves celebration in an uncritical sense, but a family that stays. That comes back. That finds each other again at the end of the episode, in the house that is always there, in the present that is always now. There is not a comedy running on network television that has told you more clearly, over a longer period of time, with more honesty about how hard it actually is and how much it actually matters, that the thing worth doing, the hardest and most essential thing, is staying. Family Guy stayed, and that, more than any joke or any cutaway or any moment of genuine emotional clarity, is what the show was always about. If you made it all the way through, thank you, genuinely. This kind of long-form analysis takes time to put together, and knowing that you were here for all of it means everything to this channel. Drop a comment below telling us which character you see differently now, or which moment or detail from the show you are going to go back and rewatch with fresh eyes. We read every single one. And if you are not subscribed yet, this is a good moment. There is a lot more where this came from, going just as deep into the shows, the worlds, and the stories that turn out to have much more underneath them than they first appear. See you in the next one. Bonus section: the animation as emotional language. There is a quality in the earliest Family Guy animation that is difficult to describe but immediately recognizable if you have watched the show across its full span. It is a looseness. A willingness to let lines be imprecise, to let movement be a little rough, to let the physicality of the characters carry a slight uncertainty that the later, cleaner animation removed. Rough Draft Studios handled seasons 2 and 3 of Family Guy, and their work on those seasons gave the characters a specific kind of expressiveness that is often cited by long-term fans as the gold standard for the show's visual identity. The characters moved with a spontaneity that the slicker post-revival animation lost. Peter's physicality was rubber-limbed in a way that communicated both his mass and his surprising agility. Brian's more restrained movement made every gesture he did make feel deliberately chosen. Stewie's precision of movement, the small, careful, controlled actions of someone who is doing everything with intention, was more apparent when the animation around him had that organic roughness. Animation quality in a comedy series matters for reasons that go beyond aesthetics. The way a character moves determines how a joke lands. Timing in animation is physical. The number of frames between an action and a reaction, the arc of a swing, the speed of a collapse. And the difference between a joke that works and a joke that almost works is often entirely located in that physical timing. The early Family Guy animation had timing that was instinctive in the way that good live-action physical comedy is instinctive. It felt like the animators were having fun. The post-revival animation was technically more sophisticated, but emotionally less alive. The outlines were sharper, the colors were cleaner, the movement was more controlled. But the controlling removed something. The characters became slightly more like their own illustrations, rather than themselves. The spontaneity that made Peter's slapstick feel genuinely surprising, the sense that even the character did not know quite how he was going to fall, was smoothed into a predictability that made the comedy safer and smaller. Stewie's face in the early seasons is one of the most expressive animated faces in the show's history. The small variations in his expression across a single scene, the micro movements of his eyes and mouth that indicate internal states the dialogue is not announcing, are the work of animators who were genuinely engaged with what the character was feeling, not just what he was doing. In the later seasons, Stewie's face became more standardized, his expressions drawn from a smaller vocabulary of established poses. He became more legible and less surprising. Meg's animation is an interesting case study in the relationship between how a character is drawn and how a character is perceived. In the early seasons, Meg was drawn as an ordinary-looking teenager, not glamorous, not ugly, just unremarkable in the specific way of adolescence. The animation honored the comedy premise of her normality by drawing her normally. In the later seasons, as the jokes about her appearance became crueler and more central to her characterization, the animation of Meg shifted slightly to accommodate that cruelty. She was drawn in a way that emphasized the comedy of her appearance rather than its ordinariness. The animation became complicit in the joke in a way the early seasons avoided. This is not a small thing. How you draw a character shapes how the audience perceives them, and how the audience perceives them shapes how the jokes about them land. The early Meg was normal, and the jokes about her were about the comedy of normality. The later Meg was drawn toward her own punchline, and the jokes landed differently because the drawing had already done the work of framing her as the butt of them. Lois's animation across the seasons contains an interesting piece of character continuity that is easy to miss. The warmth in her face, the openness of her default expression, is more present in the early seasons and more guarded in the middle ones. This is not a conscious choice anyone would point to in a production meeting. It is the accumulated effect of animators drawing a character whose emotional life had changed, and the change showing up in the small habitual details of how the face was composed between its active expressions. The eyes slightly less open, the smile slightly less immediate. These are tiny changes, invisible in any single frame, that accumulate across seasons into a portrait of a person who has been carrying things for a long time. Brian's animation has always been the most formally controlled in the regular cast, and this is right. Brian is a character who curates his own presentation, and his physical carriage, upright, slightly studied, carrying the self-consciousness of someone who knows they are being observed, is consistent from first season to last even when his character writing was not. The animation kept the character's dignity when the scripts sometimes forgot to. The chicken fight sequences deserve their own formal analysis because they are among the most technically accomplished pieces of animation the show produced. Each iteration of the Peter versus Ernie battle escalates in cinematic scale and formal ambition. The third and fourth chicken fights are staged and shot with the full visual vocabulary of action cinema. Dynamic camera angles, specific timing on impacts, choreography that tracks across multiple spaces. They are, whatever else they are, genuine demonstrations of what can be accomplished in the animation medium when time and care are applied to a comedic premise. The fact that these fights are comedic does not make the animation less real. If anything, the juxtaposition, the action movie visual scale applied to a cartoon man fighting a giant chicken, is what makes them work. The comedy depends on the animation being genuinely good. If the fights were sloppily staged, the joke would collapse. The joke is that this is being treated as seriously as an action movie. And treating it seriously required the animators to actually make it, as well as they would make an action sequence. This is Family Guy's approach to comedy in its formal mode. Commit fully to the production value of whatever is happening, even if what is happening is absurd. The full commitment is part of the joke, but it is also not reducible to the joke. There is something in the craft itself that exceeds the comedy it serves. Bonus section: what 14-year-olds understood. There is a specific group of people who have a relationship to Family Guy that is unlike anyone else's relationship to it. And those people are the ones who discovered the show between the ages of about 12 and 16, in the period between 2005 and 2012, when it was at both its cultural peak and its most formally chaotic. These viewers were too young to have watched the original 3 seasons in their first run. They came to the show through the revival, through Adult Swim reruns, through older siblings' DVD collections, through the early YouTube clip economy that made individual cutaway gags into the most viewed comedy content on the internet. They encountered Family Guy as a cultural phenomenon rather than as a television series with continuity and context. And they found something in it. Not the same thing a more attentive adult viewer would find. Not the emotional architecture or the character depth or the formal sophistication, but something real and specific to their situation. The show told 14-year-olds something that most of the media directed at them would not say. It told them that families are hard, that the adults in your life are failing in ways they may not be aware of, that the image of domestic happiness presented in most culture is a production rather than a reality, that you are right to notice that something is off, even if you cannot name what it is. This is not a small thing to offer a teenager. The show was giving them permission to be skeptical of the narrative, and even if the delivery mechanism was a cartoon with a talking dog and a joke about Conway Twitty, the underlying permission was real. The darker emotional content of the show, the Meg storylines, the Brian in the Vault material, the moments when the comedy dropped and something genuinely sad appeared, resonated with that teenage audience in ways the show's creators may not have fully anticipated. For a 14-year-old navigating the specific species of difficulty that is adolescence in an imperfect family, watching Meg Griffin stand up to her parents and then be forced to take it back was not just a television moment. It was an encounter with a feeling they recognized. The show was not designed for that specific resonance, but it achieved it because the emotional content it was exploring, invisibility, the labor of absorbing family dysfunction, the specific frustration of being smarter than your circumstances, is not age-specific. It is the experience of anyone who has ever been in a household that was not quite safe, not quite seen, not quite honest about what it was. Family Guy was an accidental comfort to many people who needed it in ways no one planned for. That is not a justification of its more troubled content, but it is a fact about what the show was in people's lives, and why so many people who encountered it young carry an attachment to it that their more sophisticated older selves sometimes struggle to explain. The show gave them something, not everything, not the right things always, not without cost, but something real, something that was in them already and that the show had the honesty to name. That is the final thing Family Guy was underneath all of it. An honest show dressed in dishonest clothing. A tender show that could not stop pretending to be cruel. A drama about love that would not admit it was a drama about love, wrapped in enough comedy and enough noise and enough cutaway gags about the 1970s that the admission could always, if necessary, be denied. It could never quite look you in the eye and say what it meant. But it meant it. Every season, every episode, every absurd detour, and every moment of genuine feeling that arrived without warning in the middle of something you were only half watching. It meant it. And somehow, despite everything, you knew. Bonus section: The Griffin House as a character. The house at 31 Spooner Street in Quahog, Rhode Island is not a neutral backdrop. It is a character. And like all the characters in the show, it carries meaning that exceeds its functional role as the location where the story happens. The house is modest. It is the right size for a family of 5 with a dog. Not comfortable, not spacious, not the kind of home that announces prosperity. It has a front yard that is always slightly unkempt, a living room that is centered around a television, a kitchen that Lois fills with the smells of meals that the family will consume too quickly and without adequate gratitude. The layout of the house, the way the rooms connect, the way people move through them, encodes a specific domestic arrangement that is recognizable to anyone who grew up in a working-class American household. The television at the center of the living room is not incidental. The Griffin family organizes itself around the television the way other families organize themselves around a dining table or a fireplace. The television is where they come together. It is where they are present in the same space without necessarily being present to each other. The television is doing the social work that conversation should do, but cannot always manage in this household. This is not a critique of the Griffin family. It is a portrait of how a lot of families actually work. The shared screen is the shared space. The thing you watch together is the thing you hold in common. You may not be able to talk to each other about what you feel, but you can watch the same thing and feel it separately and know, somewhere below words, that you felt it together. Peter's relationship to the television is one of the most observationally precise details in the show's depiction of working-class American domesticity. He watches it with a quality of absorption that is both escape and engagement. He is fully transported by it. He takes it personally. He argues with it, laughs at it, is moved by it in ways he cannot be moved by the actual people sitting next to him. The television is safer than the people. It cannot disappoint him, cannot need things from him, cannot find him inadequate. He can feel with the television without being accountable for the feeling. The fact that the first episode is called Death Has a Shadow and centers on Peter losing his job and hiding this from Lois by collecting welfare checks, a story about a man protecting a domestic secret to preserve the appearance of stability, establishes the house as a space where reality and performance coexist in uneasy proximity from the very beginning. The house is a performance of domestic life. The family performs their roles inside it. Sometimes the performance and the reality align. Often they do not. And the show's entire run is about the gap between the house as it appears and the house as it is. The kitchen is Lois's space in the most consistent and specific way. She feeds the family. She is present in the kitchen in a way she is not always present elsewhere. The kitchen is where she is most herself, not because homemaking is her identity in some reductive sense, but because the kitchen is the one room in the house that asks of her the skills she was genuinely trained for and that she actually wants to use. She is good at this. She takes it seriously. The care she brings to feeding her family is a form of love that the family rarely acknowledges and that the show treats, in its best moments, with the seriousness it deserves. The basement and the upstairs rooms operate as the show's private spaces, the spaces where the characters retreat when the communal rooms become too charged. Stewie's nursery is his laboratory. His weapons, his time machine, his inventions. They all live in a room that is officially decorated for an infant. The juxtaposition of the child world decor and the advanced technology is part of the show's fundamental comedy, but it also says something about the relationship between surface and reality. The room looks like what society says a baby's room should look like. What the room actually contains is something entirely different. Chris's room is the space the show uses least, which is fitting. Chris inhabits a kind of benign irrelevance in the family structure. He is there, he is loved in the distracted way that middle children are often loved. He has his own inner life that the show occasionally reveals with a warmth it does not always sustain. His room is the room that no one needs to enter urgently, which is its own form of characterization. The spaces that people fight over in a household are the spaces that matter. The room no one urgently needs is the room of the person no one urgently worries about. Meg's room is the most charged space in the house after Stewie's nursery, and it is charged precisely because the show so rarely enters it. Meg's interior life, her journals, her music, her aesthetic sensibility, lives in that room, and the show's decision to keep the camera out of it most of the time is either a missed opportunity or a formal choice about privacy. Meg is the character with the most invisible interior life, and her room is the physical space where that invisible interior life lives. By keeping the camera outside, the show preserves the invisibility that is the thematic heart of her characterization. The drunken clam exists in relationship to the house as the show's alternative domestic space. If the house at Spooner Street is where the Griffins work out their family dynamics, the drunken clam is where Peter and his friends work out the thing they cannot manage at home. The simple pleasure of presence without demand. At the bar, no one needs anything from you except to show up. You can sit in silence if you need to. You can tell the same stories you have told 100 times before. The familiarity is not boredom. It is home by a different name. The Pewterschmidt estate, when the show visits it, functions as the negative image of Spooner Street. It is everything the Griffin house is not. Large, elegant, quiet, organized around the display of wealth, rather than the management of daily life. When Lois and Peter visit her parents, the contrast between the two houses is the contrast between the life Lois chose and the life Lois left. The estate is where Lois is reminded of the trade she made. The house on Spooner Street is where she lives with the consequences of that trade, and occasionally with the rewards of it too. The show never sentimentalizes the Griffin house. It is not depicted as a paradise of domesticity. It is depicted as a real house, scratched and worn and occasionally broken, inhabited by real people who are imperfectly managing real lives. But across decades of episodes, across every adventure and catastrophe and comedy premise that took the characters far from Quahog, the house was always there at the end. Waiting. Lit from inside. The family returning to it the way people return to the things that hold them. Not because those things are perfect, but because they are theirs. In the final frame of the show's opening credits sequence, the family seated at the piano, playing together, the theme swelling. The house is visible around them. The walls, the furniture, the specific modest texture of a working-class living room. The house is the context that makes the image make sense. Without it, the family is just people. With it, they are home. That image, repeated at the beginning of every episode for more than 2 decades, is the show's most persistent and most earnest gesture. Not a joke, not a cutaway, not a meta-commentary or a shock moment or a piece of edgy transgression, just a family, at home, making music, and the house holding them while they do. Bonus section. Why it stays with you. There's a reason people rewatch Family Guy at night, at low volume, in the particular state of half-wakefulness that sits between sleep and full consciousness. It is not just the familiarity, though familiarity is part of it. It is not just the comedy, though comedy is genuinely comforting in that liminal state where the brain wants engagement, but not demand. It is something harder to name. A quality of presence. The feeling that the people in this show are real enough to be company. This is what the show was building toward, with all its hidden architecture, with all its careful character work, with all the music and the specificity and the moments of genuine emotional honesty tucked inside the comedy. It was building toward the feeling of being in a room with people who exist, not fully, not completely, not with the three-dimensional density of actual human beings, but enough. Enough to keep you company. Enough to make the quiet of a late night slightly less quiet. The Griffins are not a family you would choose. Peter would exhaust you. Lois would make you feel slightly judged. Brian would make you feel slightly condescended to. Stewie would unsettle you in ways you could not quite articulate. Meg would break your heart a little every time you looked at her, because you would see exactly what she needed and exactly what she was not getting, and you would know there was nothing you could do about it. But you would go back to them. You do go back to them. Millions of people have gone back to them, season after season, year after year, long past the point when the show was at its best, because the family at Spooner Street became, through the accumulated weight of all those hours of watching, people that the audience had a history with. And history, even fictional history, generates a feeling of relationship. There is a word in psychology for the feeling of connection to fictional people. Parasocial relationship. The word can sound dismissive, as if the connection is lesser because the people are invented. But the feelings that emerge from parasocial relationships are real feelings. The care is real. The grief when something bad happens to these characters is real grief, felt in a real body by a real person. The feeling of comfort when things turn out okay is real comfort. The show built those relationships carefully, even when the craft was inconsistent, even when the writing was uneven, even when the character work was being neglected in favor of a quick laugh. Underneath all of that, the core relationships persisted. Peter still loved Lois. Brian and Stewie still needed each other. Meg was still there, still trying, still the most human person in a family that mostly could not see her. These are the things that stay with you. Not specific jokes, not specific cutaways, though some of those stay with you too. What stays is the feeling of these people, the texture of their company, the specific quality of warmth and discomfort that comes from spending time in a household where people are doing their imperfect best. The show understood one final thing that its reputation as a chaos comedy does not prepare you for. It understood that being seen imperfectly is still being seen. That a family that cannot love you perfectly is still a family. That a show that cannot consistently honor the emotional complexity it built is still honoring it when it manages to. That the attempt matters. That the reaching towards something true, even when you do not reach it, leaves a mark. Family Guy reached. Across 25 seasons, across hundreds of episodes, across every commercial break and every Fox network scheduling decision and every critical dismissal, and every year the ratings dropped further, the show kept reaching towards something that was worth reaching for. It was reaching toward the feeling of home, of people who are yours, of the ordinary, irreplaceable, devastating experience of being part of a family that loves you in all the ways it can manage and fails you in all the ways it cannot avoid. You watch it late at night, volume low, and that reaching is what you are receiving. Not the jokes, not the chicken fights, not the Conway Twitty songs or the cutaway gags or the shock moments. The reaching. And on the right night, in the right quiet, it finds you. That is the thing the show was doing all along. That is the thing. It was never quite a comedy.